It is 1957. In a gleaming suburban kitchen in Levittown, New York, a woman named Carol is having a moment of profound existential satisfaction. Her kitchen is a testament to progress. The refrigerator is a majestic pastel pink Westinghouse, humming with the quiet confidence of post-war industrial might. On the Formica countertop, a Sunbeam Mixmaster stands ready to vanquish any lump that dares to form in a cake batter. Her husband, Bob, is at work at a company that designs guidance systems for missiles, a job that is both incredibly important and entirely vague. He leaves every morning in a chrome-laden Chevrolet Bel Air, a 2-ton land yacht with tail fins that could put an eye out. Their 2 children, Bobby and Sue, have just returned from a school drill where they learned how to survive a thermonuclear blast by hiding under their desks, a strategy whose primary benefit was that it gave the children something to do. Tonight for dinner, Carol is preparing a marvel of modern convenience: Salisbury steak TV dinners, served on folding tray tables in front of their new Philco television set. The world, according to the television, is a simple place. There are good guys, who are Americans, and there are bad guys, who are communists. The communists want to take away your Mixmaster, your Chevrolet, and your freedom to watch I Love Lucy. The solution to this problem, according to men with serious faces on the television, involves Bob's job, the drills at school, and a national stockpile of nuclear warheads large enough to turn the entire planet into a radioactive parking lot several times over. This is America at the absolute peak of its power and the absolute peak of its weirdness. It is a nation that has split the atom and invented the cheese-stuffed hot dog. It is a country so rich it can afford to pave over paradise and put up a parking lot, and then feel a little sad about it while driving to a drive-in movie theater. It is a global superpower terrified of teenagers listening to Elvis Presley gyrating his hips on television. It is a society built on conformity that is simultaneously giving birth to the beats, rock and roll, and the seeds of every rebellion that will define the next half-century. It is a character, a single entity, that is confident, powerful, wealthy, and at the same time, deeply, profoundly, pants-wettingly paranoid. The air is thick with contradictions. Freedom is the word on everyone's lips, yet a vast surveillance state is being constructed to sniff out anyone with unorthodox thoughts. Progress is the national religion, yet people are digging holes in their backyards and stocking them with canned goods in case progress gets a little too enthusiastic and ends the world. It's a nation that sees itself as a shining city on a hill, a beacon of liberty, but it also has separate water fountains for different colored people and is actively overthrowing democratically elected governments in other countries if they seem a little too friendly with the wrong crowd. America in this moment is a walking, talking, land-developing, missile-building, hula-hooping paradox. So how did we get here? How did we arrive at this specific, bizarre junction of immense power and profound anxiety, of technological utopia and apocalyptic dread, of conformist tract housing and explosive cultural rebellion? How did this character, this sprawling, chaotic, contradictory entity called America, come to be? Well, to understand the paranoid suburban dad with a bomb shelter in his backyard, you have to go back to his childhood, and his childhood was a mess. It all started with a bunch of people who really hated their landlord and had some very specific ideas about God, but mostly it started with the tantalizing, intoxicating, and often fatal dream of getting rich quick. Let us rewind, way back, before the pastel refrigerators and the intercontinental ballistic missiles, before the Constitution and the powdered wigs, back to when the continent was just a giant, inconveniently large piece of real estate full of people who had no idea they were about to be discovered. The story of America doesn't begin with a noble quest for freedom. It begins with a guy who was bad at math. His name was Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailor who managed to convince the King and Queen of Spain to fund a get-rich-quick scheme. His plan was to sail west to get to the east, which was a bit like trying to get to your kitchen by drilling through the living room floor. He thought the world was much smaller than it was, a miscalculation on the scale of thinking a house cat is a suitable guard animal for a bank. When he finally bumped into some islands, he was convinced he was in the East Indies. He called the people he met Indians, a naming error of such epic proportions that it has stuck for over 500 years, a testament to the power of being confidently wrong. Columbus wasn't looking to start a new society based on liberty and justice. He was looking for gold, spices, and a trade route that would cut out the middlemen. What he found instead was a whole new hemisphere, which he and his successors would proceed to treat like a combination of a theme park and an open-pit mine. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas was less a discovery and more a home invasion on a continental scale. The native populations were introduced to exciting new European concepts like smallpox, influenza, firearms, and the idea that their land wasn't actually their land. For the next century, Spain and Portugal had a great time, looting the southern parts of the continent with ruthless efficiency. They became fabulously wealthy, which made the other countries in Europe, particularly England, incredibly jealous. England was the up-and-coming power, the scrappy kid on the block who looked at Spain's shiny new empire and thought, "I want one of those." The problem was, England was a bit late to the party. By the time they got their act together, all the good, gold-filled parts seemed to be taken. So they were left with the leftovers, the cold, rocky, and decidedly less glittery coastline of North America. So in the early 1600s, English people started trickling across the Atlantic. And these weren't necessarily the best and brightest. For the most part, the people who volunteer to get on a leaky wooden boat for a 2-month journey across a terrifying ocean to a place of unknown terrors and questionable plumbing are people who are running from something. They were a motley crew of religious fanatics, get-rich-quick dreamers, people who were one step ahead of the law, and a whole lot of poor, desperate folks who were just hoping to eat regularly. These were the humble origins of America. Not a band of unified visionaries, but a collection of disparate, often mutually hostile groups of misfits who agreed on only one thing: England was annoying. This early America had a split personality, which can be roughly divided into two main camps: the people who came for God and the people who came for gold. Let's start with the gold seekers because their story is funnier. In 1607, a group of about 100 men and boys, sponsored by the Virginia Company, a joint stock company which was the 17th century equivalent of a risky tech startup, sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. They called their settlement Jamestown in honor of their king, James I. Their primary objective was not to build a lasting society. Their primary objective was to find gold, silver, and a river route to Asia. They were, in essence, a bunch of treasure hunters with a business plan. The problem was, their business plan was terrible. The first clue that these guys were not exactly survivalist material was the manifest of who they brought. It was a list heavy on gentlemen, which in 17th century parlance meant men who were allergic to manual labor, and jewelers. They brought jewelers to a swampy wilderness. They were fully prepared to appraise the massive piles of gold they were sure they were about to find. What they did not bring was a sufficient number of farmers, carpenters, or anyone who knew how to, survive. They chose a location for their settlement that was swampy, mosquito-infested, and had terrible water, but had the strategic advantage of being hidden from passing Spanish ships, which was a bit like choosing to build your house inside a volcano because it has a low crime rate. The result was a predictable catastrophe. They spent their days digging for gold that wasn't there instead of planting crops. They drank contaminated water and promptly came down with all sorts of unpleasant diseases. When winter came, they began to starve. It was a period they charmingly called the starving time. It got so bad they ate their horses, then their dogs, then their rats, and then, in a few desperate cases, each other. The whole enterprise was on the verge of collapsing into a gruesome, cannibalistic failure. The only thing that saved them was the arrival of supply ships and the imposition of brutally strict martial law by a series of increasingly exasperated governors. One of them, Captain John Smith, a gruff, self-promoting mercenary, basically had to tell the gentlemen that if they didn't work, they wouldn't eat. This was a revolutionary concept for them. Now you might have heard of John Smith in connection with a lovely story involving a Native American princess named Pocahontas. The Disney version involves a handsome, blonde John Smith and a beautiful Pocahontas falling in love and singing duets with woodland creatures. The real story is a bit different. Smith was a short, bearded guy in his late 20s. Pocahontas was a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old. The famous incident where she supposedly saved his life by laying her head on his before he was to be executed by her father, Chief Powhatan, is recorded only by Smith himself, years later. And most historians think he either made it up or completely misunderstood a ritual ceremony. It was less a romance and more a very confusing and probably terrifying episode of cross-cultural miscommunication. The Jamestown colony limped along, a financial black hole for its investors back in London. It seemed doomed to be another failed English attempt at colonization, and then they found their gold. It wasn't yellow and shiny, it was green and leafy. Its name was tobacco. A man named John Rolfe, who, in a much less Disney-fied romance, did actually marry Pocahontas, a political marriage intended to secure peace, figured out how to cultivate a strain of West Indian tobacco that was palatable to English tastes. And the English went absolutely bonkers for it. They couldn't get enough. Suddenly, Virginia had a cash crop, a massively profitable, addictive, soil-destroying cash crop. This changed everything. The colony was no longer a failing treasure hunt. It was a booming agricultural enterprise. People flooded in, not gentlemen looking for gold, but indentured servants. Poor Englishmen who sold 7 years of their life for passage to America and the promise of land at the end of it. It was a brutal system, but it provided the labor needed to work the vast tobacco fields. And this is where one of America's founding contradictions gets baked into the cake. The demand for labor was insatiable. Indentured servants were expensive and inconveniently became free after a few years. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia and sold about 20 captive Africans to the colonists. This was the beginning of chattel slavery in English North America. The pursuit of wealth born from the sweet, smoky profit of tobacco created a system of human bondage that would define and torment the nation for centuries to come. The Southern personality of the American character was born, ambitious, agrarian, hierarchical, and built on a foundation of profound hypocrisy, a society obsessed with its own liberty while denying it to millions. This was the first side of the coin. America, the place you go to get rich, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, up north, a completely different kind of crazy was taking root. If the South was founded by people looking for gold, New England was founded by people who were convinced God was their personal real estate agent. These were the Puritans, and their slightly less intense cousins, the Separatists. Both were English Protestants who felt the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was still too much like the Catholic Church. It was too fancy, with all its bishops and rituals and stained glass. They wanted to purify it, to strip it down to its bare, sermon-heavy essentials. The Separatists were even more extreme. They didn't want to purify the church. They wanted to break up with it entirely. The most famous of these Separatists were the Pilgrims. In 1620, a small group of them, after a brief and uncomfortable stay in Holland, decided to sail for America. They crammed themselves onto a boat called the Mayflower, which was less of a cruise ship and more of a floating petri dish. Their journey was miserable. They were aiming for Virginia, where they had permission to settle, but they got blown off course by storms and ended up in what is now Massachusetts, a cold, rocky, and entirely unwelcoming place in the middle of November. Before they even got off the boat, they realized they had a problem. They were outside the jurisdiction of any government, so the men gathered in the cabin and drafted a document called the Mayflower Compact. It was a simple agreement to form a civil body politic and obey the laws they would create for themselves. It was a remarkably pragmatic piece of improvisation, a foundational moment in the American idea of self-government, born out of the immediate need to stop a bunch of cranky seasick people from murdering each other. Their first winter was even worse than Jamestown's. They were unprepared, arrived too late to plant anything, and about half of them died from disease and starvation. They were saved from total annihilation by the local Wampanoag tribe, who, for reasons of their own complex regional politics, decided that these pathetic, starving Englishmen might be useful allies. A man named Squanto, who had been kidnapped by earlier English sailors, taken to Europe, and somehow made his way back, served as a translator and taught them how to plant corn and where to fish. This brings us to the first Thanksgiving. Now, you may have heard the story that the Pilgrims, overflowing with gratitude, invited their new Native American friends to a big feast to celebrate their first successful harvest and live happily ever after. This is a very nice story. It is also mostly a 19th century invention to create a feel-good national origin myth. There was a harvest celebration in the autumn of 1621. The Wampanoag did attend, but it wasn't a formal invitation. When the Pilgrims started firing their guns in celebration, the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, showed up with 90 of his warriors, probably thinking they were under attack. It turned into a 3-day feast, but it was likely a tense, politically charged affair, more of a diplomatic summit with food than a family get-together. The peace it represented was fragile and temporary. Within a generation, the children of these same people would be engaged in a brutal, bloody war. The Thanksgiving myth papers over a much more complicated and tragic reality, but it serves a purpose. It gives America a birthday party that isn't about profit or slavery, but about piety and intercultural harmony, even if that harmony was largely fictional. The Pilgrims were a small appetizer. The main course of the New England migration was the Puritans. Starting in 1630, a much larger, better-funded, and better-organized group of them sailed to Massachusetts Bay, led by a lawyer named John Winthrop. They weren't separatists. They wanted to build a model society in America, a city upon a hill, that would be so righteous and pure that it would inspire England to reform itself. They were on a mission from God, and they took it very, very seriously. They were disciplined, literate, and they came in family groups ready to build a permanent society. And build they did. They established towns, schools, including Harvard College in 1636 primarily to train ministers, and a government that was a theocracy in all but name. To be a full citizen with the right to vote, you had to be a male member of the church. And to be a member of the church, you had to convince the elders that you had experienced a genuine, soul-shattering conversion experience. It was a society based on community, conformity, and a deep-seated anxiety about eternal damnation. They were obsessed with order and morality. They had laws against everything from blasphemy to playing cards to celebrating Christmas, which they considered a decadent pagan festival. This created a society that was stable and prosperous, but also incredibly repressive. If you didn't fit in, you were in trouble. A woman named Anne Hutchinson started holding religious meetings in her home and suggesting that people could have a direct relationship with God without the intervention of a minister. For this, she was put on trial, excommunicated, and banished. A minister named Roger Williams argued for the separation of church and state and for dealing fairly with the Native Americans by, paying them for their land. For these radical ideas, he was also banished. He fled south and founded the colony of Rhode Island, which became a haven for religious dissenters, misfits, and anyone else who found the puritanical stick up Massachusetts' backside to be a bit much. The darkest chapter of this Puritan obsession with order was the Salem witch trials in 1692. A group of young girls in Salem Village started having fits and accusing people of bewitching them. What started as a small-town drama spiraled into a full-blown mass hysteria. A special court was set up, spectral evidence, testimony that the accused's spirit had appeared to the victim in a dream was allowed, and a wave of accusations, confessions, and denunciations swept through the community. Before it was over, 19 people had been hanged, several others had died in prison, and one elderly man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. It was a horrifying episode of collective psychosis, fueled by local squabbles, religious anxiety, and a genuine belief in the devil's active presence in their world. It was a stark reminder that a society built on a rigid vision of righteousness can quickly turn monstrous when it feels threatened. So now we have the two poles of the early American personality. In the South, you have a hierarchical, profit-driven society built on cash crops and slave labor. In the North, you have a stern, communal, and deeply religious society built on small farms and a fear of God's wrath. And in between them, you had the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. These were the most diverse and, frankly, the most normal. New York had been founded by the Dutch as New Amsterdam, a purely commercial enterprise. They were there to trade furs and make money, and they didn't particularly care about your religion as long as your money was good. When the English took it over, it remained a bustling cosmopolitan port. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, a Quaker. The Quakers were a radical Protestant sect who believed in equality, pacifism, and religious tolerance. Penn established his colony as a holy experiment, where people of all faiths could live in peace. He famously made a treaty with the local Lenape tribe that was, for a while at least, actually honored. The middle colonies became a melting pot of English, Dutch, German, and Scots-Irish immigrants, a preview of the diverse, pluralistic society America would eventually become. For about a century and a half, these three distinct regions developed along their own paths. They were all English colonies, subjects of the king, but they thought of themselves as Virginians, or Massachusetts men, or Pennsylvanians, not as Americans. They traded more with England than they did with each other. They were a collection of 13 separate little entities, huddled on the edge of a vast continent, each with its own culture, economy, and set of grievances. They were like 13 siblings who lived in the same giant house, but mostly kept to their own rooms and argued over who had to take out the trash. What they needed was a common enemy to bring them together, and that enemy was about to be their own parent. The stage was set for America's rebellious teenage years. The kid was about to pick a fight with its dad, and the fight was going to be about two things that would define the American character forever: freedom and also money. The shift from 13 bickering colonies to a single rebellious entity didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn, a gradual realization that for all their differences, they had one massive thing in common: a growing resentment of being told what to do by a parliament 3,000 miles away. The catalyst for this family squabble was, as is so often the case, a fight over money that was really about respect. It all started with a war, not a war against Britain, but a war fought by Britain, partly on the colonists' behalf. From 1754 to 1763, Britain and France fought a global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. In America, it was called the French and Indian War, a nasty, brutal affair fought over control of the Ohio River Valley, and, by extension, the future of the North American continent. The British, with a lot of help from the colonists, including a young, ambitious, and slightly inept Virginian officer named George Washington, eventually won. They kicked France out of North America for good. Hooray! Victory! Everyone celebrated, and then the bill came. Wars are expensive. Incredibly expensive. Britain had racked up a mountain of debt to win the war, and a good chunk of that war had been fought to protect the American colonists from the French and their Native American allies. So, from London's perspective, it seemed perfectly reasonable to ask the colonists, who were benefiting the most from this newfound security, to chip in for the cost of their own defense. It was like your dad paying for a new security system for the house and then asking you to contribute a few bucks from your allowance. To the colonists, this was an outrage. For decades, Britain had practiced a policy of salutary neglect, basically leaving the colonies alone to run their own affairs and manage their own economies, as long as the raw materials kept flowing to England. The colonists had grown accustomed to this freedom. They had their own legislatures, their own taxes, their own way of doing things. Now, suddenly, Parliament was trying to assert direct control. And worse, they were doing it with taxes. First came the Proclamation of 1763, which drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and forbade colonists from settling west of it. This was meant to prevent costly wars with Native American tribes, but to the colonists, who saw the entire continent as their birthright, it was a slap in the face. It was like being told you couldn't go in the backyard. Then came the Sugar Act in 1764, which was actually a tax cut on molasses but included new measures to crack down on smuggling, which was a favorite pastime and a major source of income for New England merchants. This was followed in 1765 by the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house and feed British soldiers. But the one that really set things off was the Stamp Act of 1765. This was the first direct tax Parliament had ever levied on the colonists. It required them to buy a special stamped paper for everything from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards and dice. It wasn't the cost of the tax that was the problem, it was the principle. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. To them, this was taxation without representation, a violation of their fundamental rights as Englishmen. The cry went up, and it was loud. This is where the colonies started acting less like separate entities and more like a unified block of angry teenagers. The Stamp Act Congress, with representatives from 9 colonies, met in New York to draft a formal protest. In the streets, things were less formal. A secret society known as the Sons of Liberty, led by rabble-rousers like Samuel Adams in Boston, organized boycotts of British goods and used intimidation and outright violence against the stamp collectors. They burned effigies, tarred and feathered officials, and made it impossible to enforce the law. The whole thing was a spectacular failure. Parliament, stunned by the ferocious and unified opposition, repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. The colonists celebrated wildly. They thought they had won. But Parliament, in a classic passive-aggressive parent move, passed the Declaratory Act on the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act. The Declaratory Act stated that Parliament had the right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was the legislative equivalent of saying, "Fine, you win this time, but don't forget I'm still in charge." The peace didn't last. In 1767, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man named Charles Townshend, decided to try again. He was convinced the colonists had only objected to direct taxes, so he came up with a series of indirect taxes on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. These were the Townshend Acts. He was wrong. The colonists objected to these too, for the same reason. The boycotts started up again. Tensions rose, particularly in Boston, which was the hotbed of radical activity. Britain sent troops to Boston to keep order, which had the predictable effect of making everyone even angrier. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The tension exploded on March 5, 1770. A crowd of Bostonians started harassing a group of British soldiers, throwing snowballs, ice, and insults. The situation escalated. The soldiers panicked. Someone fired, and then others joined in. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead. Sam Adams and his fellow propagandists immediately dubbed it the Boston Massacre. They commissioned an engraving by Paul Revere that depicted a line of sneering British soldiers firing on a peaceful, unarmed crowd, a masterpiece of political spin that ignored the mob-like behavior of the colonists. The story of innocent martyrs murdered by tyrannical redcoats spread like wildfire through the colonies. Faced with another public relations disaster and a failing policy, Parliament once again backed down. They repealed all the Townshend duties, except for one, the tax on tea. This was a symbolic gesture, a way to maintain the principle that they had the right to tax the colonies. For a couple of years, an uneasy calm settled in, but the tea tax was a ticking time bomb. In 1773, the bomb went off. The British East India Company, a massive corporation that was the 18th century equivalent of a company that is too big to fail, was on the verge of bankruptcy. To bail it out, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This act didn't impose a new tax. It actually made tea cheaper for the colonists by giving the East India Company a monopoly on the American tea trade and allowing it to sell tea directly, cutting out the colonial merchants. The British thought this was a brilliant move. The colonists would get cheaper tea, the company would be saved, and everyone would be happy. They could not have been more wrong. The colonists saw it as a trick. It was a sneaky way to get them to accept the principle of parliamentary taxation by seducing them with cheap tea. And the colonial merchants who were being cut out of the deal were furious. In ports up and down the coast, colonists refused to let the tea be unloaded. In Boston, the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined to force the issue. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of Sons of Liberty, thinly disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This was the Boston Tea Party. It was an act of protest, an act of vandalism, and a fantastic piece of political theater. When news of the Tea Party reached London, King George III and Parliament were done playing games. They had had enough of Boston's insolence. Their response was swift and punitive. In 1774, they passed a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was altered to give the royally appointed governor more power and reduce the power of the local legislature. Town meetings were restricted, and a new, tougher Quartering Act was passed. This was no longer about taxes. This was a direct assault on the colonists' rights and self-government. Britain was trying to make an example of Massachusetts, to crush its spirit and bring it to heel. The effect was the exact opposite. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies in sympathy and outrage. Food and supplies poured into Boston from all the other colonies. If Britain could do this to Massachusetts, they could do it to any of them. This was the final straw. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia with delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia was busy with its own problems. They issued a declaration of rights and grievances and called for a complete boycott of British goods. They also agreed to meet again the following year if their demands weren't met. They were still not calling for independence. They were still hoping for a reconciliation, to restore the relationship to what it had been before 1763. But they were also advising the colonies to start arming and training their militias, just in case. The situation in Massachusetts was becoming a powder keg. The British commander, General Thomas Gage, knew that the colonial militias were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in the town of Concord, about 20 miles outside of Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, he dispatched a force of about 700 British regulars to seize the supplies and, if possible, arrest the radical leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The colonial spy network was ready. Riders, including the famous Paul Revere, fanned out across the countryside with the warning, "The regulars are coming out." At dawn on April 19th, the British troops reached the village of Lexington. On the town green, they were met by about 70 colonial militiamen, or Minutemen. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. The British commander ordered them to disperse. They were beginning to do so when a shot was fired. Nobody knows who fired it. It was the shot heard round the world. The British soldiers, without orders, opened fire on the militia, killing 8 and wounding 10. The American Revolution had begun. The British marched on to Concord, where they found that most of the military supplies had already been moved. At the North Bridge in Concord, they were met by a larger force of militiamen, and this time, the colonists fired back, inflicting casualties and forcing the British to retreat. The retreat back to Boston was a nightmare for the Redcoats. All along the road, thousands of militiamen from all over the region took cover behind trees, stone walls, and houses, firing on the column of exposed British soldiers. It was a humiliating and bloody rout. By the time the British staggered back into Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties. The colonists had proven they could and would fight. Within days, Boston was surrounded by a massive, disorganized army of New England militiamen. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. The war had started, but they were still deeply divided. Some, like John Adams, were pushing for a full break with Britain. Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, were desperately hoping for peace. As a compromise, they did 2 things. They sent one last peace petition to the king, the Olive Branch Petition, and they appointed George Washington as the commander-in-chief of their new Continental Army. Washington was chosen partly because he had military experience from the French and Indian War, and partly because he was a Virginian. The New Englanders knew they needed support from the southern colonies, and appointing a Southerner to lead the army was a shrewd political move. Washington rode north to take command of the army outside Boston. King George III, meanwhile, rejected the Olive Branch petition out of hand and declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. The chance for a peaceful resolution was gone. The war was on. Still, the idea of independence was a radical one that most colonists were not yet ready to embrace. What changed their minds was a combination of the king's intransigence and a pamphlet. In January 1776, a recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine published a 47-page pamphlet called Common Sense. It was a blistering, eloquent, and brilliantly simple argument for independence. Paine didn't use complicated legal arguments. He used plain language that anyone could understand. He attacked the whole idea of monarchy and hereditary rule. He called King George a royal brute. He argued that it was absurd for a tiny island to rule a vast continent. He laid out a vision of an independent American republic, a beacon of liberty for the entire world. Common Sense was a sensation. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and was read aloud in taverns and public squares throughout the colonies. It shattered the last psychological barrier to independence and convinced millions of Americans that a break with Britain was not just necessary, but desirable. By the summer of 1776, the momentum was unstoppable. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in Congress that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress appointed a committee of 5, including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, to draft a formal declaration. The task of writing the draft fell to Jefferson, who was known for his eloquent prose. He holed himself up for 2 weeks and produced a masterpiece. The Declaration of Independence was not just a list of grievances, it was a profound statement of political philosophy. Its famous second paragraph laid out a revolutionary idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It argued that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Of course, the man who wrote that all men are created equal was a slave owner. The Continental Congress itself, while debating the high-minded ideals of liberty, struck out a passage in Jefferson's draft that condemned the slave trade. The hypocrisy was staggering, a birth defect that would haunt the new nation. But the power of the words themselves could not be denied. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence. On July 4th, they approved the final text of the Declaration. The 13 colonies were now the United States of America. They had picked a fight with the most powerful empire on earth. Now all they had to do was win it. Winning the war was not going to be easy. On paper, it looked impossible. The British had a professional, well-trained, and well-equipped army, the most powerful navy in the world, and a vast treasury. The Americans had George Washington, and a ragtag, poorly supplied, constantly shrinking army of volunteer soldiers who had a tendency to go home when their enlistment was up or it was time to harvest the crops. The Continental Congress could ask the states for money and supplies, but it had no power to compel them. The whole effort was constantly on the verge of collapse due to a lack of food, clothing, shoes, gunpowder, and pay. The first few years of the war were a string of disasters for the Americans. Shortly after the Declaration was signed, the British landed a massive army in New York and proceeded to thrash Washington's forces repeatedly. They drove the Continental Army out of New York City, across New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. Washington's army was melting away. It was a desperate time, but Washington was nothing if not resilient. On Christmas night, 1776, in a daring gamble, he led his freezing, demoralized troops across the icy Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on a garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, New Jersey. It was a stunning victory, followed by another one at Princeton a few days later. These small victories didn't change the strategic situation much, but they were a massive morale boost. They saved the Revolution from collapsing in its first year. The turning point of the war came in 1777. The British had a grand plan to split the colonies in two by sending an army south from Canada down the Hudson River, while another army moved north from New York City. The plan was a logistical nightmare and was poorly coordinated. The main British force, led by General John Burgoyne, was bogged down in the dense forests of upstate New York, harassed by American militiamen. In October, at the Battle of Saratoga, Burgoyne's entire army was surrounded and forced to surrender to the American general Horatio Gates. Saratoga was more than just a military victory. It was a diplomatic triumph. Benjamin Franklin had been in Paris for a year, trying to convince the French to join the war on the American side. The French hated the British and were eager for revenge for their defeat in the French and Indian War, but they were hesitant to back a loser. The victory at Saratoga convinced them that the Americans actually had a chance to win. In 1778, France formally recognized the United States and signed a treaty of alliance. This changed everything. The American Revolution was no longer just a colonial rebellion. It was a world war. French money, French supplies, and most importantly, the French Navy were now on America's side. Even with French help, the war was a long, hard slog. The winter of 1777–78 at Valley Forge was a low point, with Washington's army suffering from disease, starvation, and exposure. But they held together, drilled into a more professional force by a Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben. The war shifted to the south, where the British hoped to rally loyalist support. It turned into a nasty, brutal civil war of raids and counter-raids. The final act came in 1781. The main British army in the south, under the command of Lord Cornwallis, marched into Virginia and fortified itself at a place called Yorktown, on a peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay. He was waiting to be resupplied or evacuated by the British Navy. It was a fatal mistake. Washington, in a brilliant move, secretly marched his combined American and French army south from New York. At the same time, the French Navy sailed up from the Caribbean and blockaded the mouth of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis from the sea. Cornwallis was trapped. The combined Franco-American army laid siege to Yorktown. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis, pleading illness and sending his second-in-command in his place, surrendered his entire army. When the news of Yorktown reached London, it broke the will of the British government to continue the war. It had been long, costly, and now it was a global conflict they were losing. Peace negotiations began in Paris. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States and granted it a vast territory stretching all the way to the Mississippi River. The rebellious teenager had won. It had kicked its parent out of the house. Now it had to figure out how to live on its own. The first attempt at self-government was, to put it mildly, a bit of a shambles. The new nation was governed by a document called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were written during the war by people who were deeply suspicious of any strong central authority. After all, they had just fought a war against a powerful king and parliament, so they created a government that was deliberately weak. The Articles created a firm league of friendship between the states, but not a unified nation. There was a Congress, but it had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, and no executive or judicial branch. It could declare war, but it couldn't raise an army. It could ask the states for money, but it couldn't make them pay. It was like a substitute teacher with no authority to send anyone to the principal's office. The result was chaos. The country was broke. The states were printing their own money, which was worthless. They were putting up tariffs against each other, getting into border disputes, and generally acting like 13 separate, squabbling little countries. The national government was powerless to do anything about it. The breaking point came in 1786 in western Massachusetts. Farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were losing their farms to foreclosure because they couldn't pay their debts and taxes. They were being crushed by the very government they had fought to create. A farmer and former Army captain named Daniel Shays led an armed uprising, shutting down courts and attempting to seize a federal arsenal. The Massachusetts militia eventually put down Shays' rebellion, but it sent a shockwave through the country. It was a wake-up call. The elites, the wealthy merchants, planters, and lawyers, were terrified. They saw the rebellion as a sign that the Republic was on the verge of descending into anarchy and mob rule. Something had to be done. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. The country needed a new government, a stronger government, one that could maintain order, protect property, and command respect on the world stage. So, in the summer of 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island ever the contrarian, refused to attend, gathered in Philadelphia. Their official purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they quickly decided to scrap the Articles entirely and write a whole new constitution. For 4 hot, humid months, they met in secret with the windows nailed shut to keep their deliberations from the public. They argued, they debated, they compromised. It was a gathering of some of the most brilliant political minds in the new nation. The scholarly James Madison, who came with a plan and is now known as the father of the Constitution. The elder statesman Benjamin Franklin, who provided wisdom and humor. The ambitious Alexander Hamilton, who argued for a powerful British-style government. And presiding over it all, the universally respected George Washington, whose presence lent legitimacy to the whole enterprise. They faced a series of daunting challenges. How to create a government that was strong enough to be effective, but not so strong that it would become tyrannical. How to balance the interests of the large states and the small states. And the most explosive issue of all, what to do about slavery. On the issue of representation, they came up with the Great Compromise. They created a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives where representation would be based on population, pleasing the large states, and a Senate where each state would have 2 senators, regardless of size, pleasing the small states. On the issue of slavery, they punted. They made a series of rotten compromises that would embed the institution of slavery into the very fabric of the new government. They agreed to the 3/5 compromise, which counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of both taxation and representation. This gave the southern states more power in Congress than their free population warranted. They also included a fugitive slave clause, requiring the return of escaped slaves to their owners, and they agreed that the slave trade could not be banned for at least 20 years. The delegates, for the sake of unity, chose to kick the can of slavery down the road, a decision that would eventually be paid for in blood. The final document created a revolutionary new form of government. It established a federal system, dividing power between the national government and the state governments. It created 3 separate branches of government: the legislative, Congress, the executive, the president, and the judicial, the Supreme Court, with a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. It was a government of we the people, deriving its power from the governed, yet it was also designed to be insulated from the passions of direct democracy. The president would be chosen by an electoral college, and senators would be chosen by state legislatures. Getting the Constitution ratified was another battle. The Federalists, who supported the new Constitution, led by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, wrote a series of brilliant essays known as the Federalist Papers, arguing for its adoption. The Anti-Federalists opposed it, fearing that it created a central government that was too powerful and that it lacked a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. In the end, the Federalists won, but they had to promise to add a Bill of Rights as the first order of business for the new government. In 1789, the Constitution was ratified, and the United States of America had its second and final attempt at a government. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president. He was a reluctant president, more interested in retiring to his farm at Mount Vernon, but he knew the new nation needed him. He was the only one everyone trusted. He and the first Congress had to invent the presidency from scratch. They created the first cabinet departments, established the federal court system, and, as promised, passed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing fundamental rights like freedom of speech, religion, and the press. The early years of the Republic were dominated by the fierce rivalry between 2 of Washington's cabinet members: his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. They had 2 completely different visions for the future of the country. Hamilton, the Federalist, envisioned an industrial and commercial powerhouse, a strong central government led by a wealthy elite, and a close relationship with Britain. Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, envisioned an agrarian republic of small, independent farmers, a weak central government, strong states' rights, and a close relationship with France. Their clashes gave birth to the first American political parties. Washington hated the idea of parties, warning that they would divide the nation, but he was powerless to stop them. Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, laid out an ambitious financial plan to put the nation on a solid footing. He proposed that the federal government assume the war debts of the states, create a national bank to stabilize the currency, and impose tariffs and taxes to raise revenue. Jefferson and Madison fought him every step of the way, but Hamilton, through a series of political bargains, including the famous deal to locate the nation's new capital on the Potomac River in exchange for Southern votes for his debt plan, got his program passed. His policies created a stable financial system and laid the groundwork for a powerful national economy. Washington served 2 terms, and then, in 1796, he did something remarkable. He voluntarily gave up power. In a world of kings and emperors, the idea of a leader willingly walking away was revolutionary. In his farewell address, he warned the nation against political factions and entangling alliances with foreign powers. The country promptly ignored both pieces of advice. The election of 1796 was a bitter contest between Washington's Vice President, John Adams, the Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. Adams won, and under the weird rules of the time, Jefferson, as the runner-up, became his vice president. It was an awkward arrangement. Adams's presidency was plagued by conflict with France and fierce partisan fighting at home. The Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, a series of laws designed to silence their Democratic-Republican opponents, a blatant violation of the First Amendment that remains a black mark on his presidency. In 1800, Adams and Jefferson faced off again. The election of 1800 was one of the nastiest in American history, full of personal attacks and wild accusations. It ended in an electoral tie between Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr. The election was thrown into the House of Representatives, where it took 36 ballots to finally choose Jefferson as president. This chaotic election led to the passage of the 12th Amendment, which changed the way presidents and vice presidents are elected. But more importantly, the Revolution of 1800 marked the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another. The Federalists had lost, and they stepped down without a fight. The system worked. Jefferson's presidency was defined by one massive, unexpected event. In 1803, he sent envoys to France to try to buy the port of New Orleans from Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, who had just lost an army in Haiti and was about to go to war with Britain again, needed money. He stunned the American diplomats by offering to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory, a vast swath of land that would double the size of the United States. Jefferson, the strict constructionist who believed the president only had the powers explicitly granted in the Constitution, had a moment of crisis. The Constitution said nothing about the president being able to buy foreign land, but it was too good a deal to pass up. He gulped, set aside his principles, and bought it for the bargain price of $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. With the stroke of a pen, he had secured the future of his agrarian empire. He then dispatched Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their epic 2-year expedition to explore the new territory, a journey that became a foundational story of American exploration and adventure. The young nation was growing, and it was growing confident. A little too confident. Tensions with Britain were rising again. The British were fighting a desperate war against Napoleon, and in their efforts to blockade France, they were seizing American ships and impressing American sailors, forcing them into service in the Royal Navy. This was an affront to American sovereignty and honor. A new generation of congressmen, the War Hawks, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, were clamoring for war. They also had their eyes on expanding into British Canada and Spanish Florida. In 1812, President James Madison, Jefferson's successor, asked Congress to declare war on Britain. The War of 1812 was a strange, messy, and ultimately pointless conflict. The United States was completely unprepared for it. The invasion of Canada was a series of embarrassing failures. In 1814, the British, having defeated Napoleon, turned their full attention to America. They sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, marched on the new capital city, and burned the White House and the Capitol building in retaliation for an American raid on a Canadian city. It was the low point of the war, but the Americans had a few successes. On the high seas, American frigates like the USS Constitution won a series of stunning single-ship duels against the Royal Navy. And at the very end of the war, after the peace treaty had already been signed in Europe but before the news had crossed the Atlantic, General Andrew Jackson, a tough, irascible frontiersman from Tennessee, cobbled together a motley army of regulars, militia, pirates, and free black soldiers and won a spectacular, lopsided victory over a veteran British army at the Battle of New Orleans. The War of 1812 ended in a draw. The treaty that ended it basically just restored the status quo. Nobody gained or lost any territory. But for America, it felt like a victory. They had taken on the British Empire for a second time and survived. The war shattered the last vestiges of colonial dependence and created a surge of nationalism. A new sense of American identity, forged in war, swept the nation. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, collapsed, ushering in a brief era of good feelings with only one major political party. The young republic was no longer an awkward teenager. It had survived its second fight with its dad, burned its own house down, and came out feeling more confident than ever. It was now a young adult, and it was looking west. The continent was spread out before it, and America was convinced that it was its manifest destiny to possess it all, from sea to shining sea. The rise was not over, but the character of the nation was changing. It was becoming more aggressive, more expansionist, and it was striding confidently toward a confrontation with the one issue it had refused to solve: the deep, dark and festering wound of slavery. The decades after the War of 1812 were a period of explosive growth and transformation. America was a young man on the make, full of energy, ambition, and a complete disregard for anyone or anything that stood in his way. The era of good feelings was less about actual good feelings and more about a temporary lack of organized political opposition. The nation was rapidly expanding westward, fueled by a potent ideology known as manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a convenient justification for a massive land grab, cloaked in the language of progress and liberty. The economy was also changing. A market revolution was underway, connecting the country in new ways. The North was beginning to industrialize, with factories powered by water and later, steam. The South remained agricultural, its economy utterly dependent on king cotton and the enslaved labor used to produce it. The West was the land of opportunity, a vast expanse of farms producing food for the rest of the nation. These three distinct regional economies were linked by a transportation revolution. Canals, like the massive Erie Canal completed in 1825, and later, railroads, stitched the country together, allowing goods and people to move with unprecedented speed. This era also saw the rise of a new kind of politics. The old system, dominated by a small elite of gentlemen, gave way to a more boisterous, populist style. Property qualifications for voting were dropped, and universal white male suffrage became the norm. Politics became a mass spectacle, with rallies, parades, and partisan newspapers that slandered their opponents with gusto. The figure who best embodied this new era was Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a war hero, an Indian fighter, and a man who presented himself as a champion of the common man against the corrupt Eastern elites. In 1828, he was elected president in a landslide, heralding the beginning of the Age of Jackson. His presidency was tumultuous and transformative. He waged a political war against the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as a tool of the wealthy and a threat to democracy. He vetoed its recharter, a move that was popular with his supporters but contributed to a financial panic later on. Jackson's presidency also saw one of the ugliest episodes in American history: Indian removal. For decades, the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, had adopted many aspects of white culture. The Cherokee had a written language, a constitution, and farms, but they were living on land that white settlers coveted for cotton cultivation. Despite a Supreme Court ruling in the Cherokee's favor, Jackson defied the court. He famously said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let him enforce it." He pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress in 1830, which forced the tribes to move west of the Mississippi to what is now Oklahoma. The forced march of the Cherokee in 1838, on which over 4,000 of them died from disease, hunger, and exposure, is known as the Trail of Tears. It was an act of ethnic cleansing driven by greed and racism, and it left a permanent stain on the nation's honor. While the country was expanding and Jackson was reshaping the presidency, the issue of slavery was bubbling just beneath the surface, threatening to tear the nation apart. The first major crisis came in 1820. Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. This threatened to upset the delicate balance in the Senate between the 11 free states and the 11 slave states. The debate was fierce and bitter. Thomas Jefferson, in retirement, called it a fire bell in the night, a warning of the catastrophe to come. A compromise was eventually reached, brokered by Henry Clay of Kentucky. The Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state, but also admitted Maine as a free state, preserving the balance. It also drew a line across the southern border of Missouri, the 3630 parallel, prohibiting slavery in all remaining territory of the Louisiana Purchase north of that line. It was a temporary fix, a geographical band-aid on a moral cancer. Over the next few decades, the divide between North and South deepened. In the North, the abolitionist movement, once a fringe group, began to gain strength. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, who published the anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass, a former slave whose powerful oratory and writing exposed the horrors of the system, called for the immediate and uncompensated emancipation of all slaves. In the South, the response was a hardening of attitudes. Southerners began to defend slavery not just as a necessary evil, but as a positive good, arguing that it was a benevolent institution that was good for the slaves, good for the masters, and the foundation of a superior civilization. The westward expansion kept pouring fuel on the fire. Every time a new territory was acquired, the question of whether it would be free or slave had to be answered. The annexation of Texas was a prime example. American settlers, many of them slaveholders, had moved into the Mexican province of Texas. In 1836, they declared their independence from Mexico and fought a short, successful war to establish the Republic of Texas. For nearly a decade, Texas existed as an independent nation, the Lone Star Republic, because its admission to the United States was blocked by Northern opposition to adding another large slave state. But the spirit of manifest destiny was too strong. In 1844, James K. Polk, a hardline expansionist, was elected president on a platform of annexing both Texas and the Oregon Territory. Texas was annexed in 1845. This immediately led to a border dispute with Mexico, which Polk, a man who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to start a war to get it, used as a pretext for conflict. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, was a short, one-sided affair. The American Army, led by generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, won a series of victories, culminating in the capture of Mexico City. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, Mexico was forced to cede a vast territory to the United States, including all of present-day California, Nevada, and Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. It was a massive prize, the fulfillment of manifest destiny, but it came with a curse. A young congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot had proposed an amendment to a war funding bill, the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. The proviso passed the House but failed in the Senate, but it set the terms for the debate to come. The question of slavery in the new territories would dominate American politics for the next decade and push the nation to the brink of collapse. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 only made the problem more urgent. The gold rush brought a flood of settlers to California, and by 1850, it was ready for statehood. It applied to enter the Union as a free state. This would once again upset the balance of power in the Senate. The South was furious and threatened secession. The nation was facing its most serious crisis yet. Once again, the great compromiser Henry Clay stepped in to try to patch things up. Working with the young senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, he crafted a package of 5 separate bills known as the Compromise of 1850. It was a complex and fragile deal. California was admitted as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah were organized on the principle of popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers in those territories would get to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was abolished in the District of Columbia. And to appease the South, a new, much tougher Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This law required all citizens, including those in the North, to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. It was the most controversial part of the compromise. To Northerners, it made them complicit in the system of slavery. It brought the reality of slavery home to them in a way that nothing else had. The sight of federal marshals hunting down and capturing people on the streets of Boston and other northern cities and forcing them back into bondage radicalized many who had previously been indifferent to the issue. The Compromise of 1850 bought a few years of uneasy peace, but it was the calm before the storm. The fundamental conflict was unresolved. The nation was like a house with a massive crack running through its foundation. The crack was slavery, and every attempt to paper over it just made the eventual collapse more certain. America, the confident young man, was about to have a complete and violent nervous breakdown. The swaggering ambition and relentless expansion had led it to this point. It had gobbled up a continent, but it was about to choke on the moral poison at its heart. The pivot was coming, the moment that would change the character of the nation forever. It would be a brutal, bloody, and soul-crushing affair, a war fought not against a foreign power, but against itself. The Civil War was not just a pivot, it was an amputation, a desperate surgery to remove the cancer that had been there from the beginning. And it would leave scars that would never fully heal. The 1850s were a decade of escalating tension, a 10-year slide into the abyss. The fragile peace of the Compromise of 1850 was shattered in 1854 by a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. Douglas was a man with presidential ambitions and a deep belief in the principle of popular sovereignty. He was also a champion of westward expansion and wanted to build a transcontinental railroad that would run through his home state. To do that, he needed to organize the vast unorganized territory west of Missouri and Iowa, so he introduced a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The bill proposed to divide the territory into 2, Kansas and Nebraska, and crucially, it proposed to let the settlers in those territories decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty. The problem was that this territory was north of the 3630 line established by the Missouri Compromise, where slavery was supposed to be prohibited forever. The Kansas-Nebraska Act would effectively repeal the Missouri Compromise, which had been considered a sacred pact for over 30 years. Southerners loved the bill. Northerners were enraged. They saw it as a betrayal, another craven concession to the slave power. Despite the firestorm of protest, Douglas, a master legislative tactician, managed to push the bill through Congress. The result was a disaster. The act turned the Kansas Territory into a battleground. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri and anti-slavery settlers, many of them funded by abolitionist societies in New England, flooded into Kansas, each side determined to win the territory for its cause. What followed was a miniature civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. Rival governments were set up. Pro-slavery border ruffians raided the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. In retaliation, a fanatical abolitionist named John Brown and his sons dragged 5 pro-slavery men from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. The violence in Kansas was a horrifying preview of the national conflict to come. The violence wasn't confined to Kansas. In 1856, on the floor of the United States Senate, the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, a staunch abolitionist, gave a fiery speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he insulted the pro-slavery senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. A few days later, Butler's nephew, a congressman named Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate chamber, found Sumner at his desk, and beat him senseless with a heavy cane, stopping only when the cane broke. Sumner was so badly injured he couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years. Brooks was censured but resigned, only to be triumphantly re-elected. Southerners sent him new canes to replace the one he had broken. The incident showed that the comity and respect that had once governed American politics were gone. The nation's leaders were now physically assaulting each other. The political system was fracturing along sectional lines. The Whig Party, which had tried to be a national party, collapsed over the slavery issue. In its place, a new party emerged in the North, the Republican Party. It was a purely sectional party, formed in 1854 with one main goal: to stop the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. In 1856, they ran their first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, on the slogan, "Free soil, free labor, free men, Fremont." He lost, but he carried most of the North, demonstrating the new party's strength. In 1857, the Supreme Court, which had largely stayed out of the slavery debate, decided to weigh in with a decision that threw gasoline on the fire. The case was Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave who had been taken by his owner from the slave state of Missouri into the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. He sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence on free soil had made him free. The court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a Southerner, issued a sweeping and disastrous ruling. Taney's opinion made 3 explosive points. First, it declared that African Americans, whether slave or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. They had, in Taney's infamous phrase, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This meant Dred Scott had no right to even sue in federal court. Second, the court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. To do so, Taney argued, would violate the slave owner's Fifth Amendment right to his property. Third, it meant that slavery was now legal in all federal territories. Southerners were ecstatic. The nation's highest court had just endorsed their most extreme arguments. Northerners were horrified. The decision seemed to confirm their worst fears, that a slave power conspiracy controlled all branches of the federal government and was determined to make slavery a national institution. The Republican Party's platform of stopping the expansion of slavery was now unconstitutional. The decision destroyed any hope of compromise and pushed the sections further apart. The final act before the election of 1860 came in 1859. The fiery abolitionist John Brown, who had been hiding since his murderous raid in Kansas, reappeared. He had a new, even more audacious plan. He believed it was his divine mission to start a massive slave insurrection that would end slavery once and for all. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and a small band of followers seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He expected slaves from the surrounding countryside to flock to his banner, arm themselves, and begin a war of liberation. The slaves did not rise. The local militia and townspeople quickly pinned Brown and his men down in the arsenal's engine house. A detachment of U.S. Marines, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, arrived, stormed the engine house, and captured Brown. He was quickly tried for treason against the state of Virginia, convicted, and sentenced to hang. John Brown's raid was a military failure, but it was a psychological earthquake. In the South, it created a wave of terror and rage. Southerners saw Brown as a terrorist, the embodiment of a Northern conspiracy to incite slave rebellion and murder them in their beds. They saw the widespread sympathy for Brown in the North as proof that the two sections could no longer coexist. In the North, while many condemned his violent methods, Brown was hailed by many abolitionists as a martyr for freedom. On the day of his execution, church bells tolled across the North. His stoic and dignified behavior during his trial and execution turned him into a powerful symbol. As he went to the gallows, he handed a note to one of his guards that read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." He was right. The election of 1860 was the most momentous in American history. The Democratic Party, the last remaining national institution, finally split apart. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats, who rejected popular sovereignty and demanded federal protection for slavery in the territories, nominated their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge. A new party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell on a simple platform of preserving the Union and ignoring the slavery issue. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. Lincoln was a relative moderate within the party. He was not an abolitionist. He did not call for an end to slavery where it already existed, but he was firm on the core Republican principle. Slavery must not be allowed to expand into the territories. He believed, as he had said in his famous House Divided speech, that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. It would become all one thing, or all the other. With the Democrats divided, Lincoln won the election with only 40% of the popular vote. He carried every free state, but he didn't receive a single electoral vote from the 10 slave states in the South. His name didn't even appear on the ballot in many of them. To the South, the election of a purely sectional anti-slavery president was the final intolerable act. They saw it as a hostile takeover of the government by a party committed to their destruction. They had threatened secession if Lincoln was elected, and now they made good on their threat. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina, the hotbed of secessionist fervor, held a convention and voted unanimously to leave the Union. Over the next 6 weeks, 6 more states from the Deep South, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed. In February 1861, they met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They wrote a constitution that was almost identical to the U.S. Constitution, but with a few key differences. It explicitly protected the institution of slavery and guaranteed the right of slave owners to take their property into any new territories. They elected Jefferson Davis, a former senator from Mississippi, as their president. The break was complete. As the nation disintegrated, the federal government did nothing. The sitting president, James Buchanan, was a weak and indecisive man who believed that secession was illegal, but that he had no constitutional power to stop it. He dithered while the Confederacy seized federal forts, arsenals, and mints throughout the South. All eyes turned to the president-elect, Abraham Lincoln, who was due to be inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. In his inaugural address, Lincoln struck a conciliatory but firm tone. He assured the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed. He pleaded with them to return to the Union, arguing that the Union was perpetual and could not be broken, but he also made it clear that he would enforce federal law and hold on to the remaining federal property in the seceded states. He ended with a moving appeal for peace. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." The final crisis came over a small, insignificant fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Sumter. It was one of the few federal installations in the seceded states that had not yet been taken. Its small garrison was running out of food. Lincoln was faced with a terrible choice. If he abandoned the fort, he would be seen as weak and would be legitimizing the Confederacy. If he tried to reinforce it with troops, he would be seen as the aggressor and might drive the wavering states of the Upper South into the Confederacy. Lincoln chose a middle path. He decided to send only unarmed ships with food and supplies, and he notified the governor of South Carolina of his intentions. The decision was now in the hands of the Confederates. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet saw this as a challenge. To allow the fort to be resupplied would be a symbol of their own weakness. They decided to demand the fort's surrender, and if it was refused, to take it by force. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours. Miraculously, no one was killed. The fort's commander, Major Robert Anderson, finally surrendered. The Civil War had begun. The attack on Fort Sumter galvanized the North. The debate was over. The Union was under attack. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The response was overwhelming. In the South, the attack and Lincoln's call for troops were seen as an act of war. The states of the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, which had been wavering, now cast their lot with the Confederacy. The lines were drawn. 23 states in the Union, with a population of 22 million and most of the nation's industry and railroads, were now at war with 11 states in the Confederacy, with a population of 9 million, nearly 4 million of whom were enslaved. Both sides went into the war with a great deal of enthusiasm and a profound misunderstanding of what they were getting into. Both expected a short, glorious war. A single battle, they thought, would decide it all. They were tragically, horrifically wrong. The war would last 4 years and would consume the nation in a firestorm of violence and death unprecedented in its history. It would cost the lives of over 620,000 Americans, more than all other American wars combined. It would be a total war, a brutal, grinding conflict that would destroy the Old South and forge a new, more powerful, and more centralized United States. The nation's identity crisis, the pivot point of its history, was now being settled not by compromises and speeches, but by cannons and bayonets. The swaggering young man was gone, replaced by a grim-faced soldier staring into the abyss of a war against his own brother. The war began with a misplaced sense of romanticism on both sides. Young men rushed to enlist, fearing the fighting would be over before they could get their share of the glory. The first major battle of the war, at Bull Run, or Manassas as the Confederates called it, in July 1861, was a perfect illustration of this naivete. Washington socialites packed picnic baskets and rode out to watch the battle as if it were a sporting event. The Union Army, confident of a quick victory, marched out of Washington in a disorganized parade. They were met by a Confederate army that was just as green. The battle was a chaotic, bloody mess. For a while, it seemed the Union was winning, but the arrival of Confederate reinforcements and the firm stand of a Virginia brigade under General Thomas Jackson, who earned his nickname Stonewall that day, turned the tide. The Union Army broke and fled in a panicked rout back to Washington, sweeping up the terrified picnickers in their flight. Bull Run was a shock to the North. It shattered the illusion of a quick and easy war. It was a wake-up call that this was going to be a long, hard fight. For the South, it was a confirmation of their belief in their own martial superiority, but it also bred a dangerous overconfidence. On paper, the Union had overwhelming advantages. It had a larger population, a massive industrial base that could produce all the weapons and supplies it needed, a comprehensive railroad network, and a functioning navy. The Confederacy had cotton and better generals, at least at the beginning. Their strategy was defensive. They didn't need to conquer the North. They just needed to survive long enough for the North to get tired of fighting and give up. They also hoped for foreign intervention. They believed that King Cotton was so vital to the textile industries of Britain and France that those nations would be forced to recognize the Confederacy and come to its aid. The Union strategy, devised by the aging General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, was called the Anaconda Plan. It had 3 parts: blockade the southern coastline to cut off its trade, seize control of the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in 2, and then squeeze the life out of it. It was a long-term plan that reflected the scale of the task ahead. In the Eastern Theater, the early years of the war were a story of frustration for the Union. The main Union force, the Army of the Potomac, was a magnificent fighting machine, but it was cursed with a series of overly cautious and incompetent commanders. The worst of the lot was General George B. McClellan. McClellan was a brilliant organizer and administrator. He was beloved by his troops, but he was pathologically reluctant to fight. He consistently overestimated the size of the enemy forces and refused to move unless he thought he had overwhelming superiority, which he never did. He had, as Lincoln famously put it, a case of the slows. In the spring of 1862, McClellan finally launched a major offensive against the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. The Peninsula Campaign was a massive logistical undertaking, but it was executed with agonizing slowness. McClellan was repeatedly outmaneuvered and unnerved by the audacious Confederate commander, Robert E. Lee. Lee, who had taken command of the Army of Northern Virginia after its previous commander was wounded, was everything McClellan was not: a brilliant, daring tactician who was willing to take enormous risks. In a series of battles known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee, with a smaller army, attacked McClellan relentlessly, unnerved him, and drove him away from Richmond. Lee then took the war to the north. He invaded Maryland, hoping to win a decisive victory on Union soil that would convince the North to sue for peace and might bring in foreign aid. McClellan, thanks to a lucky break, a Union soldier found a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around some cigars, had a golden opportunity to destroy Lee's army. But he moved with his usual caution. The two armies met at Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862. The Battle of Antietam was the single bloodiest day in American history. In 12 hours of savage fighting, over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. The battle was a tactical draw, but it was a strategic victory for the Union. Lee's invasion was stopped, and he was forced to retreat back into Virginia. Lincoln, who had been waiting for a Union victory, finally had the opening he needed. 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He declared that as of January 1, 1863, all slaves in any state still in rebellion against the United States shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation was a brilliant masterstroke. It was a war measure aimed at crippling the Confederate war effort, which was sustained by slave labor. But it also transformed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a war to preserve the Union. It was now a war to end slavery. This gave the North the moral high ground and made it impossible for Britain and France, which had abolished slavery, to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. It also authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African-American men would serve in the Union forces, fighting for their own freedom. While the war in the East was a bloody stalemate, the Union was having much more success in the West. There, a different kind of general was emerging. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was a failed farmer and businessman, a quiet, rumpled man who had resigned from the army in disgrace years earlier, but he knew how to fight. He was not a brilliant tactician like Lee, but he was tenacious, aggressive, and he understood a simple, brutal truth about the war. The Union had more men and more resources, and it would win if it just kept fighting and grinding the enemy down. In early 1862, Grant captured two key Confederate forts in Tennessee, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. When the Confederate commander at Donelson asked for terms, Grant replied, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." The phrase earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Grant's main objective in the West was to seize control of the Mississippi River. The key to the river was the heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. In the spring of 1863, Grant launched a daring and brilliant campaign against Vicksburg. After a series of maneuvers that baffled the Confederate defenders, he laid siege to the city. For 47 days, the city was bombarded relentlessly. The residents were forced to live in caves to escape the shelling. Finally, on July 4, 1863, the starving garrison surrendered. The capture of Vicksburg, along with the fall of Port Hudson, Louisiana, a few days later, gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was cut in two. The day before Vicksburg surrendered, the war reached its dramatic climax in the East. After his victory at Chancellorsville in May, a brilliant tactical victory that came at a huge cost, including the death of his best general, Stonewall Jackson, Lee decided to invade the North for a second time. He believed a decisive victory on Union soil was the only way the Confederacy could win the war. He marched his army into Pennsylvania, where they accidentally ran into the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of the competent but unspectacular General George Meade, near the small town of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg lasted for 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. It was the largest and deadliest battle of the war. On the first day, the Confederates pushed the Union forces back through the town, but the Union troops managed to rally on a series of hills and ridges south of the town, forming a strong defensive line shaped like a fishhook. On the second day, Lee launched a series of ferocious attacks on both flanks of the Union line at places that would become famous: Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, and Little Round Top. The fighting was savage, but the Union line held. On the third day, Lee, against the advice of his subordinates, decided to risk everything on a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. This was Pickett's charge. Around 12,500 Confederate soldiers marched for nearly a mile across an open field under a hail of Union artillery and rifle fire. It was an act of incredible bravery and incredible folly. They were slaughtered. The charge was repulsed with staggering casualties. The battle was over. Lee's army was shattered. He had lost a third of his men. He retreated back to Virginia, never to mount a major offensive again. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 were the turning point of the war. The Confederacy was now on the defensive everywhere. But the war was far from over. The South was still defiant, and Lee's army was still a formidable force. Lincoln knew he needed a general in the East who would fight. In early 1864, he found his man. He brought Ulysses S. Grant east and appointed him general-in-chief of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal. He would launch coordinated attacks on all fronts to prevent the Confederates from shifting reinforcements. And he would personally lead the Army of the Potomac against Lee's army with the goal of not just defeating it, but destroying it. He told Lincoln, "Wherever Lee goes, there you will find me." In May 1864, Grant launched the Overland Campaign. For 40 days, the two armies were locked in a constant, savage struggle. The battles had names like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor. The fighting was horrific, a forerunner of the trench warfare of World War I. The Union casualties were enormous, far greater than the Confederate losses. In previous campaigns, such losses would have sent the Union Army retreating back to Washington. But Grant was different. After each bloody battle, he didn't retreat. He just kept moving south, trying to get around Lee's flank, forcing Lee to fight again and again. He was bleeding the Confederacy to death, and he knew it. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he wrote. While Grant was slugging it out with Lee in Virginia, he sent his best subordinate, General William Tecumseh Sherman, to attack Atlanta, a vital Confederate rail and industrial center. Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864. The victory was a huge boost to Northern morale and helped ensure Lincoln's re-election in November against his former general, George McClellan, who was running on a peace platform. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman proposed a radical new plan. He would abandon his supply lines and march his army of 60,000 men from Atlanta to the sea, living off the land and destroying everything of military value in his path. The purpose of Sherman's march to the sea was not just to destroy the South's resources, but to break its will to fight. It was to bring the hard hand of war home to the civilian population that was sustaining the Confederate armies in the field. His army cut a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction through the heart of Georgia, tearing up railroad tracks, burning factories and farms, and liberating thousands of slaves. In December, he reached the coast and captured the city of Savannah, which he presented to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. He then turned north and began to march through the Carolinas, the cradle of the rebellion, wreaking even greater havoc. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman was marching north. Grant had finally trapped Lee's army in a 9-month siege at Petersburg, just south of Richmond. On April 2nd, Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. His army, starving and depleted, tried to escape to the west, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces. But Grant's army was in relentless pursuit. On April 9, 1865, Grant cut off Lee's last line of retreat at a small village called Appomattox Courthouse. Lee knew it was over. He sent a message to Grant requesting a meeting to discuss surrender. The two generals met in the parlor of a private home. Lee, tall and immaculate in his dress uniform. Grant, short, slouched, and spattered with mud. Grant's terms were generous. The Confederate soldiers would not be taken prisoner. They would be allowed to lay down their arms and go home, on the condition that they would not fight again. He even allowed the men to keep their horses and mules to help with the spring planting. As the Confederate soldiers marched to formally surrender their weapons, the Union troops began to cheer. The Union commander, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, ordered his men to salute their defeated foes as a sign of respect. The war was over. The news of Lee's surrender set off wild celebrations in the North. But the joy was short-lived. 5 days later, on the evening of April 14th, Good Friday, President Lincoln and his wife went to see a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. During the third act, a well-known actor and fanatical Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box, shot Lincoln in the back of the head, and leaped onto the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Lincoln was carried to a house across the street, where he died the next morning. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a national tragedy, a final, senseless act of violence at the end of a war full of it. It was also a disaster for the South. Lincoln had favored a lenient and merciful plan for Reconstruction, to bring the Southern states back into the Union with malice toward none, with charity for all. His death brought to power a group of radical Republicans in Congress who were determined to punish the South and protect the rights of the newly freed slaves. The Civil War was the central defining event in American history. It had preserved the Union and ended slavery, the nation's original sin. It had cost 620,000 lives and left the South in ruins. It had answered the question of whether the nation was a loose confederation of sovereign states or a single, indivisible nation. The answer was clear. The United States was, not are. The war had created a new, more powerful federal government and had set the nation on a new course. The pivot was complete. The young, swaggering America had died on the battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam. In its place was a new nation, scarred and sobered, but also unified and, in some ways, reborn. The challenge now was to live up to the promise of that rebirth, to build a new birth of freedom for all its citizens. It would be a challenge the nation would struggle with for the next century and beyond. The period after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, was one of the most tumultuous and controversial in American history. It was a time of immense hope and immense failure, an attempt to rebuild the South and redefine the meaning of freedom in America. The central questions were enormous. On what terms would the defeated Confederate states be readmitted to the Union? What would be the status of the nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans? And who would control the process, the President or Congress? President Andrew Johnson, who took office after Lincoln's assassination, was a Southerner from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union. He was also a racist who had little sympathy for the freedmen. His plan for Reconstruction was lenient. He offered amnesty to most Confederates and required the Southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, but he allowed them to quickly form new all-white governments. These new governments promptly passed a series of laws known as Black Codes, which were designed to control the black population and force them back into a system of virtual slavery. They restricted their freedom of movement, required them to have annual labor contracts, and denied them the right to vote, serve on juries, or own firearms. The radical Republicans in Congress were furious. They saw Johnson's plan as a betrayal of the Union victory and a surrender to the very people who had caused the war. Led by men like Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, they took control of Reconstruction. They refused to seat the newly elected Southern congressmen and passed their own, much tougher plan. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States, including African Americans, and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws. They then passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts, placed it under martial law, and required the Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant black men the right to vote before they could be readmitted to the Union. This led to the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, which prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This period of radical Reconstruction was a revolutionary, albeit brief, experiment in interracial democracy. For the first time, African Americans in the South could vote and hold office. With the support of white Republicans, derisively called carpetbaggers from the North and scalawags from the South, they elected hundreds of black legislators, a dozen congressmen, and 2 U.S. senators. These new Reconstruction governments established public school systems for the first time in the South, rebuilt infrastructure, and expanded social services. But this progress was met with a violent and determined backlash from white Southerners. They saw the new governments as illegitimate and corrupt, a symbol of their defeat and humiliation. Secret terrorist societies, most notoriously the Ku Klux Klan, sprang up across the South. The Klan used intimidation, violence, and murder to terrorize black and white Republicans and prevent them from voting. It was a campaign of domestic terrorism aimed at overthrowing the Reconstruction governments and restoring white supremacy. By the 1870s, the North was growing weary of Reconstruction. The idealism of the post-war years had faded, replaced by concerns about economic problems and political corruption. The federal government's will to protect the rights of Southern blacks was waning. The end came with the disputed presidential election of 1876. The Democrat, Samuel Tilden, won the popular vote, but the electoral vote was in dispute due to contested results in 3 Southern states still under Republican control. A special commission was created, and in a backroom deal known as the Compromise of 1877, the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes was declared the winner. In exchange, the Republicans agreed to pull the last federal troops out of the South. The Compromise of 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction. With the federal troops gone, the last Republican governments in the South collapsed. White Redeemer Democrats took control and began the process of systematically stripping African Americans of their civil and political rights. They imposed poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to disenfranchise black voters. They passed a series of Jim Crow laws that mandated strict racial segregation in all aspects of public life. And the Supreme Court, in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, gave its blessing to this system, upholding the doctrine of separate but equal, which in practice was never equal. The promise of Reconstruction was dead. The South had lost the war, but it had won the peace. The nation had turned its back on the new birth of freedom and entered a long, dark night of racial oppression that would last for nearly a century. While the drama of Reconstruction was playing out, the rest of the country was undergoing a period of unprecedented economic growth and social change. This era, from the 1870s to the turn of the century, was dubbed the Gilded Age by Mark Twain. It was a time of glittering wealth and technological marvels on the surface, but underneath lay deep social problems, political corruption, and vast inequality. This was the age of the Second Industrial Revolution. A wave of new inventions, the telephone, the light bulb, the typewriter, transformed daily life. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, creating a single national market, and massive new industries, steel, oil, electricity, were born. This industrial boom was driven by a new breed of businessmen, the captains of industry, or, as their critics called them, the robber barons. Men like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan in finance built colossal empires, using ruthless tactics to crush their competitors and establish monopolies or trusts. They accumulated fortunes on a scale never before seen in human history. They lived in opulent mansions, threw extravagant parties, and donated vast sums to charity, building libraries, universities, and concert halls. This new industrial economy was fueled by the labor of millions of workers, including a flood of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. They worked long hours for low wages in dangerous and unsanitary conditions. When they tried to organize into unions and demand better treatment, they were often met with violent resistance from employers and the government. Labor conflicts, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Haymarket Affair of 1886, often turned into bloody battles between workers and police or private security forces. Politics in the Gilded Age was a spectator sport, marked by high voter turnout and fierce partisan loyalty, but it was also riddled with corruption. Both the Republican and Democratic parties were controlled by political machines that doled out patronage and favors in exchange for votes. At the national level, presidents were generally weak, and Congress was dominated by powerful special interests, particularly the railroads and big corporations. Issues like tariff reform and currency policy were hotly debated, but little was done to address the growing problems of industrial society. Meanwhile, the last chapter of the conquest of the American West was being written. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 spurred a new wave of settlement on the Great Plains. Miners, ranchers, and farmers poured into the region, aided by the Homestead Act, which offered free land to anyone willing to settle and cultivate it. This massive influx of white settlers led to the final, tragic series of conflicts with the Plains Indians. The Plains tribes, like the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche, were nomadic peoples whose culture was based on the buffalo. As the railroads brought hunters who slaughtered the buffalo by the millions for their hides, and as settlers encroached on their hunting grounds, conflict was inevitable. From the 1860s to the 1890s, a series of brutal wars raged across the plains. There were moments of Indian victory, like the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where a coalition of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse wiped out a detachment of the 7th Cavalry under the command of the flamboyant and reckless Colonel George Armstrong Custer. But these victories were temporary. The U.S. Army, with its superior numbers and technology, relentlessly pursued and defeated the tribes one by one. The final act was the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where the 7th Cavalry slaughtered some 200 Sioux men, women, and children, effectively ending the Indian Wars. The surviving Native Americans were confined to reservations, their way of life destroyed, their lands taken. The frontier, which had been such a powerful force in shaping the American character, was officially declared closed in the 1890 census. By the 1890s, the problems of the Gilded Age, the growing gap between rich and poor, the power of corporate trusts, the plight of farmers and factory workers, were leading to a new wave of political activism. A populist movement born among struggling farmers in the South and West challenged the two major parties and demanded reforms like government ownership of railroads, a graduated income tax, and the free coinage of silver to increase the money supply. In 1896, the Democratic Party co-opted the populist platform and nominated William Jennings Bryan, a charismatic young orator who electrified the convention with his famous Cross of Gold speech. Bryan's campaign was a passionate crusade of the common man against the moneyed interests, but he was ultimately defeated by the Republican William McKinley, who was backed by a massive corporate war chest. The populist crusade may have failed, but it signaled the beginning of a new era of reform. The Progressive Era, which spanned from the 1890s to the 1920s, was a broad and diverse movement that sought to use the power of government to address the problems of industrial society. Progressives were not revolutionaries. They wanted to reform capitalism, not overthrow it. They included muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair, who exposed corruption and social ills. Social reformers like Jane Addams, who founded settlement houses to help the urban poor, and politicians at the local, state, and national level. At the national level, the progressive movement found its champion in one of the most dynamic and colorful figures in American history, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt became president in 1901 after McKinley was assassinated. He was a force of nature, a bundle of manic energy who believed the president should be a steward of the people. He took on the corporate trusts, earning the nickname Trust Buster. He pushed for federal regulation of the railroads and for consumer protection laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, which were inspired by Upton Sinclair's horrifying novel about the Chicago meatpacking industry, The Jungle. And he was a passionate conservationist who set aside millions of acres of federal land for national parks and forests. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, continued some of his progressive policies, but he lacked Roosevelt's charisma and political skill. In 1912, Roosevelt, unhappy with Taft, decided to run for president again. When he failed to win the Republican nomination, he bolted the party and ran on his own progressive Bull Moose Party ticket. This split the Republican vote and allowed the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency. Wilson, a former college professor and governor of New Jersey, was also a progressive. He pushed through a major program of reforms, including a lower tariff, a graduated income tax, made possible by the 16th Amendment, and the creation of the Federal Reserve System to regulate the nation's banking system. While America was absorbed in its domestic reforms, it was also beginning to emerge as a world power. For most of its history, the U.S. had followed George Washington's advice to avoid foreign entanglements. But by the late 19th century, a new mood was taking hold. Some Americans began to argue that the U.S., as a great industrial nation, needed to acquire overseas colonies for raw materials and markets, just like the European powers. This new imperialism was fueled by a sense of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority and a belief in America's mission to civilize and Christianize the lesser peoples of the world. The turning point was the Spanish-American War in 1898. A Cuban rebellion against Spanish rule was being brutally suppressed, and American yellow journalism was whipping up public sympathy for the rebels. When the U.S. battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, the press blamed Spain, and the cry, "Remember the Maine," pushed a reluctant President McKinley into declaring war. The war itself was, as one diplomat called it, a splendid little war. It lasted only a few months and was a lopsided American victory. The U.S. Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, and an American army, which included Theodore Roosevelt's famous Rough Riders, captured Cuba. In the treaty that ended the war, Spain granted Cuba its independence, though it remained under U.S. protection, and ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. America suddenly had an overseas empire. The acquisition of the Philippines, however, led to a long and bloody guerrilla war, as Filipino nationalists who had fought with the Americans against Spain now turned their guns on their new colonial masters. The debate over imperialism was fierce, but the expansionists won. America had taken its place on the world stage. Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed that America should speak softly and carry a big stick. His big stick was the U.S. Navy, which he sent on a world tour to show off America's new power. He used American influence to broker a peace treaty between Russia and Japan, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was determined to build a canal across Central America. When Colombia refused to grant the U.S. the rights to build a canal across its province of Panama, Roosevelt supported a Panamanian rebellion, sent U.S. warships to prevent Colombia from suppressing it, and then quickly signed a treaty with the newly independent nation of Panama. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, was a triumph of engineering and a symbol of America's growing global reach. By 1914, America was a prosperous, powerful, and relatively confident nation, absorbed in its own progress and problems. But in Europe, a storm was gathering. A complex web of alliances, imperial rivalries, and nationalist passions was about to explode into the most destructive war the world had ever seen. When the war broke out in August 1914, President Wilson declared that the United States would remain neutral. Most Americans agreed. The war was seen as a European problem, a product of the old world's corrupt and violent power politics. For 3 years, America tried to stay out. But as the war dragged on, it became increasingly difficult. The US was trading with both sides, but the British naval blockade of Germany meant that in practice, American trade was almost entirely with the Allies. Germany retaliated with a new and terrifying weapon, the submarine, or U-boat. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The incident outraged American public opinion, but Wilson still resisted calls for war. The breaking point came in early 1917. Germany, desperate to break the British blockade, announced that it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking all ships, including neutral American ones, in the war zone. This was a direct challenge to American rights and honor. The final straw was the Zimmermann telegram, an intercepted message from the German foreign minister to Mexico, proposing a military alliance against the United States. If Mexico joined the war, Germany promised, it would help it recover the territory it had lost in the Mexican-American War, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The telegram was published in American newspapers, and public opinion turned decisively in favor of war. On April 2, 1917, Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. He portrayed the war not as a fight for territory or power, but as a moral crusade. The world, he declared, must be made safe for democracy. America's entry into World War I tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. The U.S. mobilized its economy and its people on a massive scale. Millions of men were drafted into the army. The government took control of the economy, setting production goals and prices. A massive propaganda campaign was launched to sell the war to the American people, and dissent was suppressed. The Espionage and Sedition Acts made it a crime to criticize the war or the government. The American Expeditionary Force, under the command of General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France in significant numbers in the spring of 1918, just in time to help stop the last major German offensive of the war. American troops played a key role in the battles of Château-Thierry, Belleau Wood, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Their freshness and sheer numbers helped break the back of the German army. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice and the fighting stopped. Wilson went to the peace conference in Paris with a grand vision. He laid out his 14 points, a plan for a just and lasting peace that included freedom of the seas, an end to secret treaties, and, most importantly, the creation of a general association of nations, a League of Nations, to resolve disputes and prevent future wars. But the other Allied leaders, from Britain and France, were more interested in punishing Germany and grabbing territory. The resulting Treaty of Versailles was a harsh peace that imposed crippling reparations on Germany and forced it to accept sole blame for the war. It was a treaty that would sow the seeds of an even more terrible conflict 20 years later. Wilson got his League of Nations, but when he returned home, he faced a bitter fight over ratification of the treaty. His Republican opponents in the Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, feared that the League's collective security provisions would compromise American sovereignty and drag the U.S. into future European wars. Wilson refused to compromise. He embarked on a grueling cross-country speaking tour to rally public support for the treaty, but he collapsed from a stroke and was left incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. The Senate rejected the treaty. The United States, the nation that had conceived of the League of Nations, refused to join it. The war and the failed peace left America in a mood of disillusionment and withdrawal. The idealism of the progressive era was gone, replaced by a cynical, inward-looking mood. The nation turned its back on the world and plunged headlong into the decade of excess, speculation, and cultural conflict that would be known as the Roaring Twenties. The descent into the weirdness of being a superpower had begun. America had helped win the war, tried to remake the world in its own image, and then, when the world didn't cooperate, it took its ball and went home to have a party. The 1920s were a decade of profound contradiction. On one hand, it was the Jazz Age, a time of unprecedented prosperity, cultural innovation, and social liberation. On the other, it was a time of deep-seated anxiety, social conservatism, and rising intolerance. It was as if the country had a split personality. One side a flapper dancing the Charleston, the other a Klansman in a white robe. The decade began with a wave of post-war anxiety known as the Red Scare. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had created a deep fear of communism and radicalism in America. A series of labor strikes and anarchist bombings in 1919 led to a nationwide panic. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a series of raids, arresting thousands of suspected radicals, many of whom were deported without trial. The Red Scare was a brief but intense period of political repression that revealed the dark undercurrent of nativism and intolerance in American society. This nativism also led to a new wave of immigration restriction. The Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924 established a quota system that severely limited immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. The era of open immigration was over. This conservative mood also manifested itself in the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The new Klan of the 1920s was not just anti-black, it was also anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, and anti-urban. It portrayed itself as a defender of traditional, white, Protestant American values against the corrupting influences of the modern city. It became a powerful force not just in the South, but in the Midwest and West as well, with millions of members and significant political influence. The most famous cultural battle of the decade was over prohibition. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. It was the culmination of a century of temperance activism, a noble experiment designed to reduce crime, poverty, and domestic abuse. The result was the exact opposite. Prohibition turned millions of ordinary Americans into lawbreakers. It created a massive black market for illegal liquor, which was controlled by organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago built vast empires on the profits from bootlegging, bribery, and violence. Speakeasies replaced saloons, and the cocktail became an American institution. Prohibition was a spectacular failure, a perfect example of a well-intentioned reform that had disastrous unintended consequences. But while one part of America was trying to legislate morality, another part was embracing a new, modern, and distinctly urban culture. The 1920s was a decade of sustained economic growth. The automobile, pioneered by Henry Ford and his affordable Model T, became a fixture of American life, transforming the landscape and giving ordinary people a new sense of freedom and mobility. New consumer goods, like radios and washing machines, flooded the market, fueled by a new culture of advertising and the availability of consumer credit. The stock market soared to dizzying heights, and it seemed as if everyone was getting rich. This new prosperity was accompanied by a cultural revolution. The new woman of the 1920s, the flapper, with her short hair, short skirts, and liberated attitude, rejected the old Victorian standards of femininity. Jazz music, born in the black communities of New Orleans, moved north and became the soundtrack of the decade. The Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of African-American literature, art, and music, produced brilliant works by writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. And a new generation of writers, the lost generation of F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Sinclair Lewis, produced a body of work that captured the energy, excitement, and underlying disillusionment of the age. It was the era of the first true mass culture, driven by new media like radio, motion pictures, and national magazines. And at the center of it all was a new American icon, the celebrity. Figures like the baseball star Babe Ruth, the aviator Charles Lindbergh, and the movie star Charlie Chaplin became national heroes. The politics of the 1920s reflected the decade's pro-business mood. A series of 3 Republican presidents, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, presided over an era of conservative government. Their philosophy was simple. The business of America is business. They lowered taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, raised tariffs to protect American industry, and appointed conservatives to regulatory agencies and the courts. Harding's administration was plagued by scandal, most notoriously the Teapot Dome scandal, in which his Secretary of the Interior was caught taking bribes to lease government oil reserves. But his successor, Silent Cal Coolidge, restored public confidence with his quiet, frugal, and staunchly pro-business leadership. The decade-long party came to a crashing halt in October 1929. The stock market, which had been fueled by a frenzy of speculation and borrowing, finally collapsed. On Black Tuesday, October 29th, the market lost a huge portion of its value. The Great Crash was not the cause of the Great Depression, but it was the trigger. The underlying economy was already weak. The prosperity of the 1920s had been unevenly distributed. Farmers were struggling, and workers' wages had not kept pace with productivity. The economy was over-reliant on a few key industries, like automobiles and construction, and the banking system was fragile and unregulated. The crash set off a chain reaction. Banks failed, wiping out the savings of millions of people. Businesses closed, and unemployment skyrocketed. By 1933, a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. A devastating drought in the Great Plains, the Dust Bowl, turned vast areas of farmland into a desert and sent hundreds of thousands of Okies fleeing to California in search of work. The Great Depression was a national trauma, a decade of poverty, hardship, and despair that shook the foundations of American capitalism and democracy. President Herbert Hoover, who had been elected in 1928 as a great humanitarian and engineer, seemed paralyzed by the crisis. He was a firm believer in individualism and voluntary cooperation. He resisted calls for direct federal aid to the unemployed, believing it would destroy the American character. His efforts to combat the Depression were too little, too late. The public grew increasingly angry and desperate. Shantytowns of the homeless, bitterly called Hoovervilles, sprang up in cities across the country. In 1932, the country was ready for a change. They elected the Democratic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in a landslide. FDR was a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a wealthy aristocrat who had been crippled by polio, but he had a warmth, a confidence, and an optimism that connected with the common people. In his inaugural address, he famously told the nation that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He promised the American people a New Deal. The New Deal was not a coherent, pre-planned program. It was a series of pragmatic, often contradictory, and sometimes desperate experiments designed to combat the Depression. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt pushed a whirlwind of legislation through Congress. He declared a national bank holiday to stop the run on the banks and passed emergency banking legislation to stabilize the system. He created a host of new alphabet agencies to provide relief, promote recovery, and enact reform. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work on conservation projects. The Public Works Administration, PWA, funded the construction of roads, bridges, and dams. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, built a series of dams to provide cheap electricity and control flooding in one of the nation's poorest regions. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, sought to raise farm prices by paying farmers to reduce production. The National Recovery Administration, NRA, tried to promote industrial recovery by setting codes for wages, hours, and prices, though it was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The most important legacy of the New Deal came in its second New Deal phase, starting in 1935. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, created millions of jobs, not just in construction, but also for artists, writers, and musicians. The Wagner Act dramatically expanded the rights of workers to form unions and bargain collectively. And the crowning achievement of the New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935. It created a national system of unemployment insurance, aid for dependent children, and most importantly, old age pensions. It was the beginning of the American welfare state, a recognition that the federal government had a responsibility to protect its citizens from the insecurities of the modern industrial economy. The New Deal was controversial. Conservatives attacked it as a dangerous step toward socialism, but it was enormously popular with the American people, who re-elected FDR in a massive landslide in 1936. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression. The economy remained sluggish throughout the 1930s. What ultimately ended the Depression was the massive government spending of World War II. But the New Deal did restore hope and confidence. And it fundamentally changed the relationship between the American people and their government. It created a new political coalition, the New Deal coalition of workers, farmers, immigrants, African Americans, and Southern whites that would make the Democratic Party the dominant party in American politics for the next 30 years. While America was absorbed in its domestic crisis, the world was drifting toward war again. The fragile peace of the 1920s had been shattered by the rise of aggressive militaristic dictatorships in Germany, Italy, and Japan. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. And in Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party came to power in 1933, rearmed the country in violation of the Versailles Treaty, and began a campaign of expansion and persecution. Most Americans wanted no part of the world's problems. The disillusionment of World War I had created a powerful isolationist sentiment. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts in the mid-1930s, designed to keep the U.S. out of any future war. When Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939 triggered the start of World War II in Europe, the U.S. declared its neutrality. But FDR was no isolationist. He saw Nazi Germany as a profound threat to American security and democratic values. He was determined to help Great Britain, which by 1940 stood alone against Hitler. He began to chip away at the neutrality acts. He got Congress to approve a cash-and-carry policy, allowing the Allies to buy American arms if they paid cash and transported them on their own ships. After he was elected to an unprecedented third term in 1940, he went further, proposing the Lend-Lease Act, which would allow the U.S. to lend or lease war materials to any country whose defense was deemed vital to the defense of the United States. It was a way to make America the arsenal of democracy. The U.S. was becoming increasingly involved in the war, waging an undeclared naval war against German U-boats in the Atlantic. but the American public was still deeply divided and reluctant to enter the war fully. What finally pushed the nation into the conflict came not from Europe, but from the Pacific. Japan, seeking to create a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which was really just a Japanese empire, had been expanding in Asia. The US responded with economic sanctions, culminating in a total embargo on oil, which Japan desperately needed for its war machine. Faced with a choice between backing down or going to war, the Japanese military chose war. They planned a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet, hoping to cripple it and give them a free hand to conquer Southeast Asia. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier-based planes attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was a devastating success. In 2 hours, they sank or damaged most of the U.S. battleships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. The next day, a grim-faced Roosevelt went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. He called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress approved the declaration with only one dissenting vote. A few days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. America was now fully engaged in a global two-ocean war. The party was over. The nation that had tried so hard to stay out of the world's problems was now at the center of the greatest conflict in human history. World War II was a total war, demanding the complete mobilization of American society. The country that had been mired in depression just a few years earlier transformed itself into the most formidable military and industrial power the world had ever seen. The federal government took control of the economy, establishing agencies to manage production, allocate resources, and control prices. Factories that had once made cars now churned out tanks and bombers at a staggering rate. The arsenal of democracy was running at full tilt. The war had a profound impact on the home front. Millions of men were drafted into the military, and for the first time, women entered the workforce in huge numbers, taking jobs in factories and shipyards. Rosie the Riveter, the iconic image of a female war worker, became a symbol of this new female contribution to the war effort. The war also spurred a massive migration of people, as workers moved to new industrial centers on the West Coast and in the South. For African Americans, the war offered both opportunities and continued discrimination. Over 1 million served in the segregated military, and many more found jobs in war industries. The Double V campaign called for victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. But the war also brought out a darker side of American society. The most shameful episode was the internment of Japanese Americans. Fueled by racism and war hysteria, the Roosevelt administration ordered the forced relocation of over 110,000 people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of them American citizens, from the West Coast to desolate internment camps for the duration of the war. It was a gross violation of civil liberties, justified by a non-existent threat of espionage and sabotage. The war was fought in two main theaters, Europe and the Pacific. The grand strategy of the Allies, the US, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, was Germany first. They would concentrate on defeating Hitler, the greater threat, while fighting a holding action against Japan in the Pacific. In Europe, the Allies began by attacking the soft underbelly. In 1942, American and British forces landed in North Africa, defeating the German and Italian armies there. In 1943, they invaded Sicily and then Italy, which led to the overthrow of Mussolini. But the main front in Europe was the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Red Army was locked in a titanic and unbelievably brutal struggle with the German army. The turning point on the Eastern Front came at the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Soviets surrounded and destroyed an entire German army. The long-awaited Allied invasion of Western Europe came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, over 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, under heavy German fire. After securing a foothold, the Allies broke out of Normandy and began a rapid advance across France, liberating Paris in August. In the winter of 1944, Hitler launched one last desperate counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, but it was repulsed. By the spring of 1945, Allied armies were crossing the Rhine and advancing into Germany from the west, while the Soviets were closing in on Berlin from the east. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. A week later, on May 8, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the war was a brutal naval and amphibious conflict. After Pearl Harbor, Japan won a string of victories, conquering the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and a vast Pacific empire. The turning point came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. In a stunning victory, U.S. naval aircraft sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling the Japanese Navy and ending its offensive capability. From then on, the U.S. was on the offensive, pursuing a strategy of island hopping. Led by General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific, American forces leapfrogged across the Pacific, seizing key islands and bypassing others, moving ever closer to Japan. The fighting was incredibly savage. Battles for islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were fought with a ferocity and racial hatred that exceeded even the fighting in Europe. The Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with a warrior code that forbade surrender, fought to the last man. By the summer of 1945, Japan was on the ropes. Its navy and air force were destroyed. Its cities were being firebombed relentlessly by American B-29s, but it refused to surrender. The Japanese military was preparing for a final, suicidal defense of the home islands, which American planners estimated could cost up to 1 million American casualties. It was at this point that President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office in April 1945 after FDR's sudden death, was faced with a terrible decision. The U.S. had secretly developed a new and terrifying weapon, the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project, a massive scientific and industrial undertaking, had produced the first nuclear weapons. Truman was advised that using the bomb could end the war quickly and save American lives. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, incinerating the city and killing over 100,000 people. When Japan still refused to surrender, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. Finally, on August 15th, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The war had been the most destructive conflict in human history, with an estimated 50 to 80 million deaths worldwide. It left much of Europe and Asia in ruins, and it fundamentally reshaped the global balance of power. The old European empires were shattered. In their place, 2 new superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States emerged from the war as the most powerful and prosperous nation on Earth. Its homeland was untouched by the fighting, its economy was booming, and it had a monopoly on the atomic bomb. But the alliance with the Soviet Union, born of necessity during the war, quickly disintegrated. The US and the USSR had 2 fundamentally different and incompatible ideologies: American capitalism and democracy versus Soviet communism and totalitarianism. They had 2 different visions for the post-war world. The conflict, which came to be known as the Cold War, began in Eastern Europe. The Soviet army, which had liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, remained in place, and Stalin installed communist puppet governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and elsewhere. In a famous speech in 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The U.S. responded with a policy of containment. Articulated by the diplomat George F. Kennan, the idea was to contain the spread of Soviet communism, not by trying to roll it back where it already existed, but by preventing it from expanding further. The first application of this policy was the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which provided military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey to help them resist communist pressure. This was followed by the Marshall Plan, a massive program of economic aid to help rebuild war-torn Western Europe. The goal was to create stable, prosperous democracies that would be resistant to the appeal of communism. The first major confrontation of the Cold War came in 1948 over the city of Berlin. The city was located deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, but was itself divided into 4 zones of occupation. When the US, Britain, and France moved to unite their zones and create a new West German state, Stalin responded by blockading all land and rail access to West Berlin. Truman refused to be intimidated. For nearly a year, the US and its allies supplied the city entirely by air. The Berlin airlift was a stunning logistical feat and a huge propaganda victory for the West. In 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade. That same year, the US, Canada, and 10 Western European nations formed a military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to defend against a potential Soviet attack. The Cold War lines were now firmly drawn. The year 1949 was a shocking one for the United States. In August, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly. And in October, communist forces led by Mao Zedong won the Civil War in China. The loss of China to communism was a huge blow to the American psyche and led to a bitter political debate about who was to blame. The Cold War turned hot in 1950. On June 25th, the Communist government of North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea. Truman, seeing this as a test of the containment policy, decided to intervene. The U.S. led a United Nations force to defend South Korea. The Korean War was a brutal back-and-forth conflict. After an initial retreat, UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur launched a brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon that pushed the North Koreans back to the Chinese border. But when MacArthur's forces approached the border, China intervened, sending hundreds of thousands of troops into the war and driving the UN forces back down the peninsula. The war settled into a bloody stalemate around the 38th parallel, the original dividing line. In 1953, after 3 years of fighting and over 36,000 American deaths, an armistice was signed, ending the fighting but leaving the country divided. The Korean War was the first limited war of the Cold War era, a frustrating and inconclusive conflict that set the pattern for future proxy wars between the superpowers. At home, the Cold War created a climate of fear and suspicion. The Second Red Scare was far more pervasive and damaging than the first. A hunt for communist subversives in the government and society led to loyalty oaths, blacklists, and ruined careers. The most notorious figure of this era was Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. In 1950, McCarthy burst onto the national scene by claiming to have a list of communists working in the State Department. For 4 years, he used smear tactics, baseless accusations, and televised hearings to create an atmosphere of terror. McCarthyism became a synonym for the reckless and unsubstantiated persecution of political opponents. McCarthy's downfall came in 1954 when he took on the U.S. Army in televised hearings. His bullying tactics were exposed to the American public, and the Senate finally censured him. This was the world America had built for itself. It was the leader of the free world, a global superpower engaged in a twilight struggle against a formidable ideological foe. At home, it was enjoying a period of unprecedented prosperity and consumerism, a suburban paradise of new cars, new houses, and new gadgets. But underneath the placid surface of 1950s, conformity was a deep-seated anxiety, a fear of nuclear annihilation, and a paranoia about enemies both without and within. The nation had reached the peak of its power, but it had also descended into a state of permanent low-grade psychosis. The weird, contradictory character of post-war America was fully formed. A character who could simultaneously plan a family vacation to Disneyland and practice hiding from a hydrogen bomb. The Eisenhower years of the 1950s were a period of apparent calm and stability, a welcome respite after the turmoil of the Depression and World War II. Ike, the genial former general, presided over a nation that seemed content with its newfound prosperity. But beneath the surface, powerful forces of change were at work, forces that would erupt in the turbulent 1960s. The most significant of these was the civil rights movement. The separate but equal doctrine of Jim Crow had been the law of the land since the 1890s, but African Americans had never stopped fighting against it. The movement gained new momentum after World War II. The hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home was not lost on black veterans. In 1954, the movement won a landmark victory in the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. The court, in a unanimous decision, declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson and ordering the desegregation of public schools. The Brown decision was a moral triumph, but it was met with massive resistance in the South. White citizens' councils were formed to fight desegregation, and politicians pledged to defy the court's ruling. The first major test came in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. When the governor used the state's National Guard to block 9 black students from entering Central High School, President Eisenhower, who had been reluctant to get involved, was forced to act. He sent federal troops to Little Rock to escort the students to school. It was a powerful demonstration that the federal government would enforce the law of the land. The movement also adopted a new and powerful tactic: nonviolent direct action. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, a year-long protest led by a young, charismatic Baptist minister named Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The boycott, which ended in a Supreme Court ruling desegregating the city's buses, brought Dr. King and his philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience to national attention. In the 1960s, the movement escalated its tactics. College students organized sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. Freedom riders, black and white activists, rode buses through the Deep South to challenge segregation in interstate travel, facing brutal violence from white mobs. In 1963, Dr. King led a major campaign to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in the country. The city's police commissioner, Bull Connor, responded with attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses against the peaceful protesters, including children. The images, broadcast on national television, shocked the nation and the world and helped build support for federal civil rights legislation. The high point of the movement came in August 1963 with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Over 250,000 people, black and white, gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in a massive demonstration of unity. It was there that Dr. King delivered his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech, a soaring vision of a racially integrated and harmonious America. The election of 1960 had brought a new generation to power. John F. Kennedy, the young, handsome, and charismatic senator from Massachusetts, defeated Richard Nixon in a razor-thin election. Kennedy's inaugural address inspired a generation with its call to public service. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. His presidency, which he called the New Frontier, was marked by a sense of energy and idealism. He created the Peace Corps, which sent young American volunteers to work in developing countries, and he committed the nation to the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But Kennedy's presidency was also dominated by the Cold War. In 1961, a U.S.-backed invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro exiles, the Bay of Pigs invasion, ended in a humiliating failure. Later that year, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall, a stark symbol of the division between East and West. The most dangerous moment of the Cold War, and perhaps of all human history, came in October 1962. The U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, capable of reaching most of the United States. For 13 terrifying days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy responded with a naval quarantine of Cuba and demanded that the missiles be removed. After a tense standoff, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev finally agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a secret U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and to remove American missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a sobering brush with Armageddon that led both superpowers to seek ways to de-escalate the conflict, including the signing of a limited nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. The optimism of the Kennedy years was shattered on November 22, 1963. While riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy was assassinated by a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. The assassination was a profound national trauma, a moment of collective grief and disbelief that seemed to mark the end of an era of innocence. Kennedy's successor, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was a towering figure, a master politician from Texas who was determined to use his power to complete Kennedy's unfinished agenda and to build his own vision of a great society. Johnson pushed through Congress two of the most important pieces of legislation of the 20th century. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation in public accommodations and employment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated literacy tests and other discriminatory devices and authorized federal examiners to register black voters in the South. These two laws effectively dismantled the legal structure of Jim Crow and marked the triumph of the civil rights movement. Johnson's Great Society was a massive expansion of the New Deal, an ambitious effort to wage a war on poverty and improve the quality of American life. It included programs like Medicare and Medicaid, which provided health insurance for the elderly and the poor, federal aid to education, and the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Great Society was a landmark in American liberalism, but its legacy would be overshadowed and ultimately crippled by a conflict halfway around the world, Vietnam. The United States had been involved in Vietnam since the 1950s, supporting the anti-communist government of South Vietnam against the communist government of North Vietnam and its Viet Cong allies in the South. Under Eisenhower and Kennedy, this involvement had been limited to military advisors and economic aid. But Johnson, a firm believer in the Cold War domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow, was determined not to lose Vietnam. In 1964, after a murky incident in the Gulf of Tonkin involving U.S. warships, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson a blank check to escalate the war. Starting in 1965, Johnson began a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam and sent the first U.S. combat troops to the South. Over the next 3 years, the American presence in Vietnam grew to over 500,000 soldiers. But the war was a frustrating and brutal quagmire. The U.S. was fighting a conventional war against an elusive guerrilla enemy in a difficult terrain. The strategy of search and destroy and the reliance on body counts as a measure of progress were ineffective. The massive bombing and the use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange alienated the South Vietnamese population, and the government in Saigon was corrupt and unstable. At home, the war became increasingly unpopular. A powerful anti-war movement emerged, centered on college campuses. Protests, marches, and draft card burnings became common. The war divided the nation and shattered the liberal consensus that had dominated post-war politics. The credibility gap between the government's optimistic pronouncements about the war and the grim reality shown on the nightly television news grew wider. The year 1968 was one of the most turbulent and traumatic in American history. In January, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive surprise attack on cities throughout South Vietnam. Militarily, the offensive was a failure for the Communists, who suffered huge casualties. But psychologically, it was a stunning blow to the United States. It shattered the illusion that the U.S. was winning the war and that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Walter Cronkite, the respected CBS News anchor, returned from Vietnam and declared that the war was a stalemate. Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." In March, Johnson, his presidency destroyed by the war, announced that he would not seek re-election. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, sparking riots in cities across the country. In June, Robert F. Kennedy, who was running for president on an anti-war platform, was assassinated in Los Angeles just after winning the California primary. In August, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into chaos as police brutally clashed with thousands of anti-war protesters in the streets. The chaos and division of 1968 led to the election of the Republican Richard Nixon. Nixon had been Eisenhower's vice president and had lost to Kennedy in 1960. He ran as the candidate of the silent majority, the law-abiding middle-class Americans who were fed up with the protests, riots, and social upheaval of the 1960s. He promised peace with honor in Vietnam and a restoration of law and order at home. The 1960s had begun with a sense of hope and idealism, but they ended in a haze of violence, division, and disillusionment. The civil rights movement had achieved its greatest legal victories, but the country was still deeply divided by race. The Great Society had raised hopes of ending poverty, but those hopes were being consumed by the war in Vietnam. The nation had landed a man on the moon in 1969, fulfilling Kennedy's promise, a stunning technological achievement. But back on Earth, the country seemed to be falling apart. The descent into the weirdness of being a superpower was now becoming a descent into something much more unsettling, a crisis of confidence in the nation's own institutions and its purpose in the world. Richard Nixon's presidency was a study in contradiction. He was a brilliant and ruthless politician who achieved major successes in foreign policy, but whose presidency was ultimately destroyed by his own paranoia and abuse of power. He was elected to bring the country together, but his political strategy was based on exploiting its divisions. Nixon's top priority was to end the war in Vietnam. His strategy was Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops and turning the fighting over to the South Vietnamese army, while at the same time increasing the bombing of North Vietnam to force them to the negotiating table. He also expanded the war, secretly bombing communist supply lines in neutral Cambodia and then launching an invasion of Cambodia in 1970. The invasion set off a new wave of anti-war protests on college campuses, leading to the tragic shooting of 4 students by the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University. While the war dragged on, Nixon and his brilliant and cynical national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were reshaping the Cold War. They pursued a policy of détente, a relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union. They negotiated the first major arms control treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I. Nixon's most dramatic move was his historic trip to China in 1972. Reversing decades of American policy, he opened relations with the communist government of mainland China, a move designed to drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union and to create a new, more stable, triangular balance of power. At home, Nixon's record was surprisingly moderate, even liberal in some areas. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and signed major environmental legislation like the Clean Air Act. He supported affirmative action and expanded federal spending on social programs. But his political strategy was aimed at building a new Republican majority by appealing to the cultural anxieties of white, working-class, and suburban voters. He used his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to launch scathing attacks on the liberal media, anti-war protesters, and other perceived enemies. Nixon won re-election in 1972 in one of the biggest landslides in American history, defeating the liberal Democratic candidate George McGovern. He seemed to be at the peak of his power, but the seeds of his downfall had already been sown. In June 1972, a group of bumbling burglars were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington. It soon became clear that the burglars were connected to Nixon's re-election campaign. What began as a third-rate burglary slowly unraveled into the biggest political scandal in American history. Over the next 2 years, investigative reporting by two young Washington Post journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, along with a Senate investigation, revealed a massive cover-up that reached all the way to the president himself. It was a sordid tale of political espionage, illegal campaign contributions, and abuse of power. The key question became, what did the president know, and when did he know it? The turning point came with the revelation that Nixon had a secret taping system in the Oval Office that had recorded all his conversations. When the special prosecutor appointed to investigate the scandal demanded the tapes, Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege. He ordered the firing of the special prosecutor in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, an act that caused a firestorm of public outrage. The Supreme Court eventually ruled unanimously that Nixon had to turn over the tapes. The tapes revealed that Nixon had been deeply involved in the cover-up from the beginning. They were the smoking gun. In July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against President Nixon for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Facing certain impeachment by the House and conviction by the Senate, Nixon did something no other president had ever done. On August 9, 1974, he resigned from office. The Watergate scandal was a profound trauma for the nation. It shattered the public's trust in government and revealed a dark side to the presidency. The long national nightmare, as his successor, Gerald Ford, called it, was over, but the cynicism and disillusionment it created would linger for decades. Ford, a decent and unassuming congressman who had been appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned in his own corruption scandal, tried to heal the nation. But his presidency was hobbled from the start when he granted Nixon a full pardon, a move that was meant to put the scandal in the past, but that many saw as a corrupt bargain. The mid-1970s were a difficult time for America. The economy was mired in stagflation, a painful combination of high unemployment and high inflation, caused in part by an OPEC oil embargo that sent gas prices soaring. In 1975, the long and divisive war in Vietnam finally came to an end with the fall of Saigon to the North Vietnamese, a humiliating final chapter to America's longest war. In 1976, Americans, tired of Washington insiders, elected a one-term governor of Georgia, a peanut farmer named Jimmy Carter, as president. Carter was a man of deep religious faith and integrity, an outsider who promised, "I will never lie to you." But his presidency was plagued by problems. He struggled with the intractable economic problems of stagflation and an energy crisis. His foreign policy, which emphasized human rights, was seen by some as naive. His greatest foreign policy achievement was brokering the Camp David Accords in 1978, a historic peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. But his presidency was ultimately consumed by a crisis in Iran. In 1979, Islamic fundamentalists overthrew the Shah of Iran, a key U.S. ally. When the U.S. allowed the exiled Shah to enter the country for medical treatment, angry Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. The Iran hostage crisis dragged on for 444 days, a nightly television spectacle that became a symbol of American weakness and impotence. A failed military rescue mission in 1980 only added to the sense of humiliation. By 1980, the country was in a sour mood. The optimism of the post-war era was gone, replaced by a sense of national decline and malaise. The nation was ready for another change, a sharp turn away from the liberalism of the 1960s and the perceived weakness of the 1970s. It found its voice in the former governor of California and Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan. Reagan was a master communicator, the great communicator, who radiated optimism and patriotism. He offered a simple and powerful message. Government was not the solution to our problems. Government was the problem. He promised to cut taxes, reduce government spending, and rebuild America's military and its prestige in the world. In 1980, he defeated Carter in a landslide. His election marked the beginning of the Reagan Revolution, a conservative insurgency that would reshape American politics and society. Reagan's economic program, dubbed Reaganomics or supply-side economics, was based on the idea that cutting taxes, particularly on the wealthy and corporations, would spur investment, create jobs, and lead to economic growth that would trickle down to everyone else. He pushed a massive tax cut through Congress in 1981, along with significant cuts in domestic spending on social programs. At the same time, he launched a massive military buildup, the largest in peacetime history. The result was a soaring national debt, but also a long period of economic growth and a decline in inflation. In foreign policy, Reagan took a much more aggressive and confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union, which he called an evil empire. He abandoned détente and escalated the Cold War, funding anti-communist insurgencies in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. His most ambitious and controversial proposal was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, popularly known as Star Wars, a plan to build a space-based missile defense system. Reagan's second term was marked by a surprising turn in his relationship with the Soviet Union. A new, younger, and more reform-minded leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, had come to power. Reagan and Gorbachev developed a remarkable personal rapport and held a series of summits that led to a major breakthrough in arms control. The INF Treaty of 1987, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles from Europe. The Reagan years were a time of renewed patriotism and cultural conservatism, but they were also a time of growing inequality, as the gap between the rich and the poor widened. The decade was also marked by the emergence of a terrifying new disease, AIDS, which the Reagan administration was slow to address. And his administration was tarnished by the Iran-Contra affair, a scandal in which officials secretly sold arms to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages, and then illegally diverted the profits to fund the anti-communist Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Reagan left office in 1989 as one of the most popular and transformative presidents of the 20th century. He had restored a sense of national confidence and had presided over the beginning of the end of the Cold War. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, was elected to succeed him, promising to continue Reagan's policies. The year 1989 was a watershed moment in world history. All across Eastern Europe, popular uprisings toppled one communist government after another. In November, the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War, came down. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself, weakened by economic stagnation and nationalist pressures, dissolved. The Cold War was over. The United States had won. The end of the Cold War left America as the world's sole superpower, a nation of unrivaled military and economic might. But it also left the country searching for a new purpose in a world without a clear enemy. President Bush spoke of a new world order, and he got his first chance to define it in 1990, when the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded the neighboring oil-rich kingdom of Kuwait. Bush assembled a broad international coalition, and in early 1991 launched Operation Desert Storm. The Persian Gulf War was a swift and decisive military victory. The Iraqi army was routed in a 100-hour ground war, and Kuwait was liberated. The war was a demonstration of America's overwhelming military superiority and seemed to erase the Vietnam syndrome of reluctance to use military force. But the victory in the Gulf War was not enough to save Bush's presidency. A short but sharp economic recession in 1991 and 1992 doomed his re-election chances. In 1992, he was defeated by a charismatic young governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton. Clinton was a New Democrat, a centrist who promised to focus on the economy and move the Democratic Party away from the liberal policies of the past. The 1990s were a decade of peace, prosperity, and peculiar anxieties. The economy, fueled by the tech boom and the rise of the internet, enjoyed the longest period of sustained growth in American history. The federal budget, which had been in deficit for decades, was actually in surplus by the end of the decade. But the 90s were also marked by bitter partisan warfare and a series of culture wars over issues like abortion, gun control, and gay rights. In 1994, Republicans, led by the combative Newt Gingrich and his Contract with America, won control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years. The resulting clashes between the Democratic president and the Republican Congress led to government shutdowns and a political climate of intense polarization. Clinton's second term was consumed by scandal. An investigation into a failed real estate deal from his past, known as Whitewater, led to the appointment of an independent counsel, Kenneth Starr. Starr's investigation expanded to include Clinton's affair with a young White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. When Clinton lied about the affair under oath, Starr's report accused him of perjury and obstruction of justice. In 1998, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Clinton, only the second president in history to be impeached. The Senate, however, acquitted him, and he remained in office, his popularity surprisingly high. As the 20th century came to a close, America was a nation at a strange crossroads. It was the undisputed global hegemon, its culture and economy dominant around the world. It was enjoying a period of unparalleled prosperity. But it was also a nation deeply divided by politics and culture, unsure of its role in the post-Cold War world, and seemingly obsessed with trivial scandals. The end of history, which some had proclaimed after the fall of communism, was proving to be a much more complicated and messy affair. The new century was about to begin, and it would bring with it a set of challenges that would once again test the nation's resilience and shake its sense of security to the core. The midlife crisis of the American protagonist was about to get a lot more serious. The election of 2000 was a fittingly bizarre and contentious start to the new millennium. The race between the Republican candidate George W. Bush, son of the former president, and the Democratic candidate Al Gore, Clinton's vice president, was one of the closest in American history. On election night, the outcome was too close to call, hinging on the results in a single state, Florida. What followed was a 36-day political and legal soap opera of recounts, hanging chads, and court battles. The Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide manual recount, but the U.S. Supreme Court, in a controversial 5-4 decision in the case of Bush versus Gore, halted the recount, effectively handing the presidency to Bush. Gore won the national popular vote, but Bush won the Electoral College. The election left the country deeply divided and with a sense of unease about the legitimacy of the outcome. The first 9 months of the Bush presidency were relatively quiet. He pushed through a large tax cut, his signature domestic policy initiative, and focused on issues like education reform. But on the morning of September 11, 2001, everything changed. 19 terrorists from the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airliners. They flew 2 of them into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, causing both towers to collapse. They flew a 3rd plane into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The 4th plane, believed to be headed for the White House or the Capitol, crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after its passengers fought back against the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks. September 11th was the deadliest foreign attack on American soil in the nation's history. It was a profound shock to the national psyche, shattering the sense of security and invulnerability that Americans had long taken for granted. The attacks unified the country in a wave of grief, patriotism, and resolve, and they fundamentally reoriented American foreign policy. President Bush declared a global war on terror. He told a joint session of Congress, "Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists." The first target was Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden, who were being sheltered by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. In October 2001, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom, invading Afghanistan and quickly toppling the Taliban government. But bin Laden escaped, and the war in Afghanistan would drag on for the next 2 decades, becoming the longest war in American history. At home, the government responded to the attacks with a massive expansion of national security powers. The USA Patriot Act, passed just weeks after the attacks, gave the government broad new powers of surveillance, including the ability to monitor phone calls and emails without a warrant. The Department of Homeland Security was created, combining 22 federal agencies into a single massive bureaucracy. The Bush administration, however, soon shifted its focus from Al-Qaeda to Iraq. Key figures in the administration, including Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, had long advocated for the overthrow of the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. They now argued that Hussein was a threat to the United States because he possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and had ties to terrorist groups. The evidence for these claims was thin, and as it turned out, wrong. But the administration launched a relentless campaign to sell the war to the American public and the world. Despite failing to win a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force, the U.S., along with Great Britain and a small coalition of the willing, invaded Iraq in March 2003. The invasion itself was a swift military success. The Iraqi army collapsed and Baghdad fell within weeks. President Bush landed on an aircraft carrier under a banner that read "Mission Accomplished" and declared an end to major combat operations. But the war was far from over. The post-war occupation was badly planned and executed. The U.S. disbanded the Iraqi army, creating hundreds of thousands of unemployed and angry armed men. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. A violent insurgency, fueled by Iraqi nationalists, Sunni extremists, and foreign jihadists, erupted against the American occupation. Iraq descended into a brutal civil war between Sunni and Shia Muslims. The war in Iraq became a bloody and costly quagmire, far more so than the initial invasion. It cost thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, and trillions of dollars. It diverted resources and attention from the war in Afghanistan, destabilized the Middle East, and severely damaged America's credibility and standing in the world. Back home, the economy was also showing signs of trouble. The housing market, which had been booming for years, was built on a foundation of risky subprime mortgages and complex unregulated financial instruments. In 2007, the housing bubble burst. Homeowners defaulted on their mortgages, and the value of the mortgage-backed securities held by banks and financial institutions plummeted. In September 2008, the crisis came to a head. Lehman Brothers, a major investment bank, declared bankruptcy, triggering a panic in the global financial system. Credit markets froze and the stock market crashed. The country was on the verge of a complete financial meltdown, a crisis that threatened to be even worse than the Great Depression. The Bush administration, in a stunning reversal of its free market principles, responded with a massive government bailout of the banking and financial industries, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. The financial crisis of 2008 was the backdrop for the presidential election that year. The race pitted the Republican senator from Arizona, John McCain, a veteran and former prisoner of war in Vietnam, against a charismatic young first-term senator from Illinois, Barack Obama. Obama's message of hope and change resonated with a nation weary of war and economic crisis. His campaign was a model of grassroots organization and technological savvy. In November 2008, Barack Obama was elected the 44th President of the United States, the first African American ever to hold the office. His election was a historic moment, a sign of how much the country had changed since the days of Jim Crow. Obama took office in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. His first priority was to prevent a complete collapse. He signed a massive economic stimulus package, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and continued the bailout of the auto industry. His signature domestic achievement was the passage of the Affordable Care Act, ACA, or Obamacare, in 2010. It was the most significant expansion of the social safety net since the Great Society, a complex law designed to expand health insurance coverage to millions of uninsured Americans. The ACA was a landmark achievement for the Democratic Party, but it was passed without a single Republican vote and became a deeply polarizing political issue. The backlash against Obama's policies, particularly the stimulus and the ACA, fueled the rise of the Tea Party movement, a conservative populist insurgency that demanded lower taxes, less government spending, and a repeal of Obamacare. In the 2010 midterm elections, the Tea Party wave helped Republicans win back control of the House of Representatives, leading to a period of intense partisan gridlock and confrontation. In foreign policy, Obama sought to repair America's image in the world. He ended the war in Iraq, withdrawing the last American combat troops in 2011. He also authorized the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in 2011, a major victory in the war on terror. But he also escalated the war in Afghanistan, sending a surge of troops before beginning a gradual withdrawal. And he was faced with a new wave of instability in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, which led to the overthrow of several long-standing dictatorships, but also to civil war in Libya and Syria, and the rise of a new and even more brutal terrorist group, ISIS. By the end of Obama's second term, the economy had recovered from the Great Recession, and the unemployment rate had fallen significantly. But the country was more politically polarized than ever. The partisan divide had become a chasm, fueled by partisan media, social media echo chambers, and a deep-seated cultural and ideological rift. The 2016 election was a reflection of this deep division and a stunning rejection of the political establishment. The Democratic candidate was Hillary Clinton, the former First Lady, Senator from New York, and Secretary of State, a consummate insider. The Republican candidate was Donald Trump, a real estate mogul and reality television star who had never held public office. Trump's campaign was a populist, nationalist insurgency that broke all the rules of conventional politics. He railed against illegal immigration, free trade deals, and the corrupt political establishment. He connected with a large segment of the electorate, particularly white working-class voters in the Rust Belt, who felt left behind by globalization and cultural change. The election was a shock. Polls and pundits had predicted a comfortable Clinton victory, but Trump, while losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million, won a decisive victory in the Electoral College by narrowly carrying a series of key swing states. His election was a political earthquake. a repudiation of both the Democratic and Republican establishments, and a sign of the deep anger and alienation felt by millions of Americans. Donald Trump's presidency was one of the most tumultuous and unconventional in American history. He governed as he had campaigned, with a constant stream of controversial tweets, rallies, and attacks on his perceived enemies, including the media, which he labeled the enemy of the people. He pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal and the Paris Agreement on climate change. He appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court. He signed a major tax cut, and he implemented a hard-line immigration policy, including his signature promise to build a wall on the southern border. His presidency was also dogged by an investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election and possible collusion with his campaign, which led to the appointment of a special counsel, Robert Mueller. As the second decade of the 21st century came to a close, America was a nation adrift, a superpower in the throes of a profound identity crisis. The unity of the post-9/11 era was a distant memory, replaced by a bitter and seemingly irreconcilable partisan and cultural divide. The country was still immensely powerful and wealthy, but it was also exhausted, angry, and deeply anxious about its future. The end of the American story was not an end in the sense of a death, but the end of an era of confidence and consensus. The protagonist, once a swaggering youth and then a paranoid but powerful adult, had entered a fraught and uncertain late middle age, consumed by internal squabbles and unsure of his place in a rapidly changing world. So what is the legacy of this chaotic, contradictory character called America? It's a story written in superlatives and paradoxes. It is a nation conceived in liberty that was built on the backs of slaves. It is a nation of immigrants that has been periodically swept by waves of anti-immigrant hysteria. It is a beacon of democracy that has overthrown democratically elected governments. It is a society that celebrates the rugged individualist but has also created some of the world's largest and most powerful corporate and government bureaucracies. America's balance sheet is a messy one. On the credit side, the achievements are staggering. It created a durable republic, the world's oldest continuous democracy, based on a revolutionary charter of human rights. It absorbed tens of millions of immigrants from every corner of the globe and forged them into a single, if often fractious, nation. It pioneered mass production, a consumer society, and a popular culture of blue jeans, jazz, rock and roll, and Hollywood movies that has conquered the world. Its universities and research labs have been engines of innovation, producing a stream of scientific and technological breakthroughs that have transformed modern life, from the light bulb and the airplane to the computer and the internet. It has twice saved Europe from tyranny and has, for all its flaws, been a powerful force for freedom and stability in the world for much of the last century. But the debit side is just as long. The legacy of slavery and racism is a deep and festering wound that has never fully healed, a stain on the nation's democratic ideals. The conquest of the continent involved the brutal and systematic dispossession and destruction of Native American societies. The nation's immense wealth has always been unevenly distributed, creating vast inequalities in periods of bitter social conflict. Its foreign policy has often been marked by arrogance, hypocrisy, and a willingness to use its power to pursue its own narrow interests. And its vibrant democratic culture has repeatedly been threatened by periods of paranoia, repression, and demagoguery. The central tension of the American story has always been the gap between its soaring ideals and its often sordid reality. The words of the Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal," have been a constant challenge, a promissory note that each generation has had to fight to redeem. The history of America is the history of that struggle, the struggle of enslaved people to be free, of women to be counted as full citizens, of workers to win a fair share of the wealth they create, of immigrants to find a place in a new land. So what is the final verdict? America is not the shining city on a hill of its own mythology, nor is it the evil empire of its detractors. It is something far more complex and interesting. It is a chaotic, energetic, violent, generous, creative, and endlessly fascinating experiment. It is a story of high-minded ideals and low-down compromises, of spectacular successes and spectacular failures. It's a story of a nation constantly reinventing itself, constantly arguing with itself, constantly falling short of its own best aspirations, but never, ever giving up on them. The character of America is not a simple hero or a villain. It is a flawed protagonist who stumbled into greatness, who has done great good and great harm, and who is now facing the daunting challenges of a new and uncertain century. The story is not over. The final chapter has not been written. And today, in a suburb somewhere in America, a family sits down to dinner. They are not eating TV dinners in front of a black and white set. They are eating artisanal pizza delivered by a gig worker they found on an app while scrolling through their social media feeds on their smartphones, arguing about politics with strangers on the internet. In the corner, a smart speaker is listening to their every word, gathering data to sell them things they don't need. The clothes are different, the technology is different, the anxieties are different, but the fundamental character, the beautiful and terrifying absurdity of it all, remains the same. The weirdness just keeps evolving.